When I was 5 years old, there was nothing I wanted more than the Power Rangers Megazord. It was a giant transforming robot made of other robots that were also dinosaurs, and my interactions with this toy probably ended up warping my brain for the rest of my life. Or rather, my lack of interaction with it. See, this thing was 80 Canadian dollars at Zellers, so I never managed to stick enough loonies and $2 bills into my Green Ranger piggy bank to actually afford it, so my only hope was that it would magically appear one day, gift-wrapped under a tree. And the wait for that day felt like an eternity, even if it was only about 6 months, but that was 10% of my entire existence at that point. But that day never ended up coming. I never got it, and the only time I ever got to experience the toy in person was when one of my school chums had the limited edition black and gold version. If I was at all jealous, it didn't last long, because when you're a kid, something can seem like the most important thing in the world one day and be completely forgotten the next. So eventually Power Rangers stopped being the thing and I started saving my loonies to buy a Sega Genesis instead. But all the things that I liked about that original Megazord were still things that I liked in general: the sci-fi aesthetic, the interactive, modular nature of the combination, the dinosaurs, and those all existed somewhere else as well. And eventually I became a casualty of the Beast Wars. I was vaguely aware of Transformers at the time. I have hazy toddler memories of Starscream from some random cartoon rerun, and I remember being in possession of a probably second-hand, eventually broken Metroplex, but for me, at the time, Beast Wars was its own unique thing. We didn't have cable, so the only glimpses of these characters' intended personalities or conflicts were from random episodes I happened to catch at Grandma's house or the babysitter's before school. To me, the toys themselves were the point. And a lot of what I liked about those toys is still what I like about Transformers today. See, unlike a 90s Star Wars action figure with 5 points of articulation and such rigidly defined personalities and actions that they sometimes represent individual scenes, a Maximal or a Predacon is their own story. Chewbacca is always just gonna be Chewbacca, standing up straight and ready to do nothing in particular. But Snapper, well, he's got knees for one thing, but Snapper never made it to the show. His personality, his actions, his story, that's all up to you. This toy doesn't tell the kid how to play with it, but the design is incredibly evocative of who he could be. As a turtle, he's bunkered down and defensive, playing it safe, but as a robot, he's lithe and active with his dark green shell being overtaken by a burst of energetic red. His hind legs become lethal slashing claws, and he even converts his own shell into a weapon, trading that beast mode safety for more firepower. One of my favorite aspects of Transformers is how the robot and the alternate modes interact with each other to tell you things about the character. The original Autobots were cars and trucks that you could see on the road in real life, everyday people forced to take up arms in the fight against evil. Meanwhile, the Decepticons were represented by the military, heavy industry, the media, and gun. But as a kid, I just thought they were cool. And despite that coolness, I didn't really continue on with Transformers after Beast Wars. Just as 6 months was a huge chunk of my life when I was 5, holding an interest in something for even 2 or 3 years is a massive commitment for a 7 or 8-year-old. Kids can change drastically in a short period of time, and while I remained vaguely aware of the Transformers in the early 2000s, I didn't really reapproach it until 2007 when the first live-action movie debuted. Now, say what you will about Michael Bay's Transformers movies, and I certainly have, but I was just out of high school the summer the movie came out, and the intricate alien designs and realistic vehicle modes felt to me like the toys I had as a kid had finally grown up with me. The Transformers of just a couple years prior seemed like gimmick-laden kid stuff, but these new ones seemed like capital C collectibles. So a collection began to grow, and as it did, that sense of story and play that I had as a kid began to return. The camera I bought to make movies with my friends ended up pointed at the living room floor, and the robots in my collection stopped being just toys and became actors. Now, over a decade later, that cast has expanded enormously, and I've somehow become the kind of guy who has a lot to say about the Transformers. So with this year being the franchise's 40th anniversary, there's a lot of new people who are interested in Transformers but have no idea where to start, or people who liked Transformers when they were kids and want to get back into it, and I thought it could be helpful to use my knowledge to say, no, don't do it, what are you, stupid? But if you are stupid, you're in the right place, because if you've got money to burn, I'm going to show you a bunch of really nice matches. Transformers have changed since you were a kid. For one thing, they're way more expensive now. As an example, let's go back to the original batch of toys from 1984. These were an assortment of licensed Japanese figures from like 4 different manufacturers and a bunch of different toy lines that got sold by Hasbro at various prices from $3 for Bumblebee to $24 for Optimus Prime. But that's not what they're going for today. Even though they're 40 years old, those original figures are still so iconic that they get reissued every so often. Bumblebee's latest release was in 2018 and sold for $7.86, slightly higher than his price should have been based purely on inflation alone. The price on Optimus has gone up as well. This year's reissue for the 40th anniversary is going for $75. And it's not just the older toys that have changed. Over time, Transformers toys have gotten smaller. Not universally, but people who were into Transformers as a kids in the 2000s and are now returning to the franchise as adults are noticing that overall, they don't seem to be as big as they once were. And for that, we can thank global politics. The Great Recession of the late 2000s impacted a lot of things. Among them were luxury goods like toys and the prices of the materials used to make those toys. This meant that in addition to becoming more expensive, the toys also became smaller. And because it generally takes around 18 months for a Transformer to hit the shelves after its initial conception, the effects of the recession only started to become really noticeable a couple of years after it initially ended, which made the change seem a little arbitrary to an outside observer. As a couple of examples, the Bumblebee figure from 2011's Dark of the Moon toy line was noticeably smaller than its counterpart from just a year earlier, and the toys made to tie into the Fall of Cybertron video game in 2012 were much less robust than the ones made for War for Cybertron in 2010. But people kept buying those smaller toys, so Hasbro kept making them. Back in 2006, the Classics Bumblebee mold was seen as such a shrimp that they had to include a jet ski jetpack accessory just to help fill out the package, but nowadays he towers over some modern versions of the character. Leader class figures used to be huge toys with lights and sounds, but now they're sometimes the same size as a Voyager, without any electronic components whatsoever. And if you're new to Transformers, that comparison might not be very meaningful to you, so let's take a moment to talk about size classes. Originally, Transformer toys kind of had arbitrary prices, with each type of toy having its own price based on its size, complexity, and features. But starting with Beast Wars, things became much more standardized, with figures being sorted into size classes, a practice that still continues today. In Beast Wars, there were 4 and later 5 size classes. For $5, you could get a basic figure, which was a smaller character with a simple, sometimes spring-loaded transformation. For $10, you could get a larger, more complicated deluxe class figure. This was by far the most popular category, and is the only one of these original size classes to have endured to the modern day. For $15, you could get a mega class figure. These were larger than deluxes, and for $20, you could get an ultra class figure. These guys were the big popular characters and had lots of action features. If you wanted Optimus Primal or Megatron, you weren't buying them with pocket money. Well, you could, but those are different guys. It's complicated. Finally, one $30 superclass toy was made, Optimal Optimus, who boasted an impressive 4 different modes: a guy, a crouching guy, a guy laying down with his arms out, and a guy laying down with his arms together. I can't believe they didn't do more. These price points would shuffle around for the next few years as the toy line tried out different sizes and features, but the $10 deluxe size class, or a renamed equivalent, would remain the core of the brand, with a few other staples being added over the next few years. The Transformers Energon toy line, which debuted at the end of 2003, would introduce $40 leader class figures, named because it was the size class where you could find faction leaders Optimus Prime and Megatron. Transformers Cybertron from 2005 would then introduce the $7 Scout class, a successor to the Beast Wars Basics, as well as $20 Voyager figures, the successors to the Ultras from Beast Wars. These size classes took their name from the Cybertron toy line's theme of searching the galaxy for lost worlds, and these size classes, Scout, Deluxe, Voyager, and Leader, would remain the standard of the toy line for years to come. But because it took a while to settle on those sizes, if we want a clearer picture of how the toys have changed over the years, we can stick with the Deluxes, which remained at $10 from 1996 all the way until 2009. Remember that recession? The first line-wide price hike for Transformers happened with the Revenge of the Fallen toy line, with each size class increasing in price by anywhere from $1 to $5, and Deluxes specifically going from $10 to $13. The next bump would happen in 2012, with that year's Deluxes being increased to $15, with a noticeable downgrade in quality compared to the past few years. The price would then dip back down for 2013 and 2014 before rising back up to $15 in 2015. And then the prices would go up again a year later to $17 for a deluxe class figure. And while most of the price increases were just keeping pace with inflation, and in many cases even rounding down the price to the nearest dollar, this latest increase in 2016 was the first time that prices had actually exceeded the rate of inflation. And that might have been okay if prices stayed that way, but the cost of Transformers would increase again in 2018, 2021, and 2022, where deluxe class Transformers were finally raised to their current price of $25. Adjusted for inflation, a $10 toy in 1996 should only be $20 in 2024. And that's even if a modern deluxe is comparable to those old toys. Some modern deluxe molds are even smaller than the $7 Scouts from a decade and a half ago. The other size classes are in similar positions. The initially $20 Voyagers are now $34 and closer in size to the $15 Megas from Beast Wars. Leaders, which are no longer foot-tall behemoths with lights and sounds, have jumped from $40 to $56. There's also even more expensive toys on the market, like $90 Commander class figures and $200 Titans, which themselves were cheaper when they debuted in 2013. But even though the toys are smaller and more expensive than they used to be, that's not the full story, because in 2024, a 1984 Bumblebee figure should be about $9 today, which is even more than its 2018 reissue. So if we compare him to the Core Class Bumblebee from 2021, they're about the same size, but now he's like an actual guy with elbows and hands and everything. Or how about Optimus Prime? What's the modern equivalent? It might be the Leader Class Optimus Prime, which comes with all the same accessories, plus the ability to transform without taking his hands off, and is also about $15 cheaper, adjusting for inflation. Or maybe this year's Commander Class Optimus Prime, which has a higher $90 price tag, but is also larger and looks even more like the original cartoon. Or if you want a straight update of the original figure, maybe the Missing Link Optimus is what you're after. This gives the original toy modern articulation without changing the design at all. The only problem is that the version that is $70 doesn't come with the trailer, which does seem like a bit of a ripoff. There should be a cheaper version. And hey, there is. Hasbro's doing a deluxe-sized interpretation of the same basic idea for a mass retail release, and it's only $25. And yeah, that figure is smaller than the original, but the trade-off is a massive improvement in engineering and detail. Rather than being giant bricks of plastic that might not even have separate legs, Transformers these days are intricate, dynamic puzzles with posability that older figures could only even begin to approach by completely abandoning their ability to transform. And speaking of, let's compare to a modern, non-transforming collector figure. Remember Chewbacca from earlier? Well, Kersantin here represents the latest advances in Wookiee technology. Released in 2023 for $34, he is the Star Wars equivalent of a Transformers Voyager. So let's compare him to Voyager-class Tarn, released in the same year. Kersantin is heavier and ever so slightly taller, but Tarn is way more dynamic with articulated hands, the ability to hit extreme poses, and probably most importantly, he can also turn into an entirely separate toy. Even when they're smaller and maybe even more expensive, Transformers still have a lot more going on than a lot of the other collector lines out there. And Transformers aren't just for collectors or any one group. Nowadays, there are Transformers for everyone. It used to be that a Transformer was just a Transformer. They were toys for kids, and that was it. But now, every age group and variety of fan, from toddlers to teenagers to adult collectors, have something being made for them. There's cartoons for kids, but there's also movies delivering huge action spectacle, and comics telling mature, complicated stories that are about more than just selling toys. There's allegedly video games coming out. And gay! Transformers are gayer than ever. But getting from point A to point Z has taken 40 years, and there's been a lot of interesting history along the way, so while you don't need to know all of it to start getting into Transformers, maybe there's a part of that history beyond just what's on shelves right now that's going to speak to you. While Transformers as we know them first hit shelves in 1984, their DNA is actually much older than that. If you want the full story, Chris McFeely has a great video explaining all the details, but the short version is that when Hasbro's original 12-inch G.I. Joe toys were first licensed in Japan by the toy company Takara in 1970, the American military soldier thing didn't really take off, so they decided to use the basic concept and create their own toy line called Henshin Cyborg, which could transform by swapping around his limbs or outfits to become different different types of characters. Then, as the 70s energy crisis caused oil prices to rise, Henshin Cyborg was downsized into a smaller toy line called Microman. Then, to supplement these smaller figures, Microman introduced vehicles and other accessories for the 3 3/4-inch figures to use. And because the vehicle aspect of that toy line became so popular, Takara then created a toy line that was focused on just the vehicles, which was called Diaclone, and is short for Diamond Cyclone for some reason. And it was the 1982 Diaclone toy line, known as Car Robots, that featured recognizable vehicles which transformed into mech suits piloted by the now very small human figures, and that was then licensed back to Hasbro to form the core of the original Transformers toy line. There were other toy lines involved as well, some from Takara, some from other places, but the important thing is that for the first couple of years, the Transformers were either pre-existing figures or toys that were about to enter production as something else, and just had new Transformers lore and characteristics slapped onto them. In fact, the first transforming robot toy that Takara made was in 1978, which gave them several years to refine their ideas before they ever hit shelves in North America. That also means that when Hasbro ran out of Japanese toys to use, they had to start making their own from the ground up, and it took a little while for them to find their footing. Aside from the learning curve that Hasbro needed to deal with, there was also a big aesthetic difference with the Hasbro toys due to the series making a 20-year time skip for the 1986 animated movie. The latter years of Generation 1 were filled with futuristic vehicles rather than cars and trucks you could actually see on the road. That's not to say Takara dropped out of Transformers entirely. They continued to develop the brand in Japan and Europe, and even made some Japanese exclusive characters like Starsaber, who looked way more like a Gundam than the more Star Wars-esque designs the American toys had. And maybe because of the far-out space nuts that Hasbro and Takara were putting on shelves instead of robots that turned into realistic vehicles, the brand began to wane. There were other factors, of course. Killing all the most popular characters in the movie probably didn't help, and remember, kids just tend to grow out of things in general. So, in order to maintain interest, Hasbro introduced new gimmick after new gimmick in order to keep Transformers going. First, it was small partner accessories that transformed into the head, weapon, or engine of the larger robots. Then it was robots that turned into He-Man-esque warriors and monsters. After that, they tried to capture some of the Micro Machines audience by making smaller Micro Master Transformers and playsets. And finally, following in the footsteps of Hasbro's articulated G.I. Joe figures, Transformers abandoned transformation altogether in 1990 with Action Master toys that drove around in their vehicles rather than turning into them. And when Transformers no longer transform, maybe it's time to call it quits. So the brand cooled to a simmer for the next several years. 1992 saw the creation of Transformers Generation 2, which included re-releases and new color schemes for toys that the new 90s kids never got a chance to play with in 1984, as well as some new interpretations of classic characters like Optimus and Megatron. Most notably, Generation 2 was the first time that Megatron turned into a tank. Famously, the original Megatron figure transformed into a gun, likely because it was the only toy in Takara's transforming robot lineup that had enough accessories to make it a worthy price match for Optimus Prime's truck and trailer combo. But the problem with a kid running around with a realistic toy gun is that they're more likely to be shot in the head by the dad from Family Matters. So, when they decided to revisit the character later in the 90s, they took a swing at reinventing him. And that's kind of been a staple of Megatron ever since. While Optimus Prime reliably turns into some variety of big truck unless there's a brand collaboration, Megatron sported a variety of alternate modes over the years depending on the needs of the story and the whims of the toy designers. But reinventing a gun into a tank or a truck into a different truck wasn't really gonna cut it to revitalize the entire brand. And Transformers Generation 2 fizzled out after 3 years, ending in 1995. So with the franchise basically dead, Hasbro gave someone else a shot at reviving it, passing the Transformers brand over to Kenner, a smaller toy company that Hasbro had purchased and was primarily known at that point for making the original run of Star Wars action figures. Inspired by the Japanese Guyver series, Kenner's design team moved away from the blocky 80s robot look and towards something more organic. And from there, they hit upon the idea to have the Transformers turn into realistic-looking animals instead of vehicles. And while some of the teens and young adults who had grown up with the original Transformers toys hated the change, the kids of the 90s loved it, as well as the accompanying cartoon, which used, at the time, cutting-edge 3D animation, and followed the descendants of the original Autobots and Decepticons who lived 300 years after the end of the previous generation's war. And aside from just the conceptual evolution, the actual engineering of the toys advanced greatly during this line as as well, largely thanks to ball joints. Because Transformers are toys, they need to abide by various safety regulations before they can actually make it to shelves. And one of the issues that Hasbro ran into when they started making their own Transformers as opposed to just relying on existing pre-approved figures was that toys with limited articulation were easier to break. If you move a figure's limb in a direction it's not supposed to go, it might just snap off. So during Generation 1, a lot of toys just had their limbs fused together to make them stronger, but lost the ability to actually do stuff in the process. To solve problems like this, Takara designer Takeo Ejima began adding more and more ball joints to the toys so that the arms and legs would just pop off rather than breaking. These joints also allowed some toys in Generation 2 to have more articulation than their predecessors, and by Beast Wars, ball joints were universal. But Beasts with big balls isn't enough on its own to sustain a franchise, so the Beast Wars began to add more and more gimmicks of its own, just like the first generation had, and just like Transformers toy lines would continue to do for decades to come. And that's because toys don't exist in a vacuum. In order for people to buy them, stores need to sell them. And in order for stores to want to stock the toys, they need to be sure that they will sell. And in order to be sure they'll sell, they like to believe that the product is new. Optimus Primal may have been a popular character, but even if he got a new toy, putting him in the same packaging with the same branding 2 years in a row creates the illusion of old merchandise. So most Transformers toy lines will come up with some new gimmick every year that justifies changing the packaging and maybe adding what's called a subline in order to convince retailers that they're getting new product and to stop parents from asking, "Don't you already have this toy?" And while this is a clever marketing tactic, it also means there's a massive amount of product out there with a bunch of different names to keep track of. Or sometimes just the same name. The phrase robots in disguise could refer to any of 4 separate toy lines. So after 2 years of standard Beast Wars packaging, the line switched things up with the Fusors, robots that could transform into chimeras combining aspects of 2 different animals, as well as Transmetals, which reversed the idea of robots hiding inside realistic animals and instead had vacuum metallized mechanical beasts transform into fleshy and hairy bipedal robots. 1998 also saw Transformers take a very important step forward from its roots as a boys-only toy line. While there had been female characters in the franchise going all the way back to the original cartoon and a couple of toys representing them, they'd always been designed as male first and then just reused or reinterpreted as female later. For example, the character Airrazor's original toy in 1997 was designed as male, and the Japanese dub of the show even kept her that way, with the character only being female in the North American cartoon. But as the toy line shifted more and more to be based on the cartoon, 1998's Deluxe Class Transmetal Airrazor became the first Transformers toy to be specifically designed from the ground up to represent a female character. So of course she was written out of the show before the toy could appear. But Airrazor would be followed in 1999 with Mega Class Transmetal 2 Black Arachnia, who did make it to television. And this toy is still a major milestone in the Transformers brand. Even 25 years later, Transformers still has a bit of a problem with female characters. They are getting a lot more representation than they used to, with about 10% of the toys in the recent Legacy toy line being female, but even though that's a huge increase from 0 during the heyday of Generation 1, there seems to be a reluctance to spend any more money than is strictly necessary to put them on shelves. And to understand how and why, we need to take the first of many detours. Transformers toys are distributed in quarterly waves, and each of those waves has a more or less standard amount of figures. These days it's 3 or 4 Deluxes, 2 Voyagers, 1 or 2 Leaders, with a couple of smaller core class figures sprinkled in if the line warrants it, and then there's also the big annual Commander and Titan class toys. And because there's fewer of those bigger, more expensive Voyagers and Leaders released during the year, it's more important to get character selection for them right, and more to lose if they don't end up selling, or as collectors call it, shelf warming. So because Transformers are largely considered boys' toys, the conventional toy industry wisdom is that figures of female characters won't sell as well and are a bigger risk at higher size classes. There is a way to mitigate that risk though, and that's by making cheaper toys. Like everything else that gets made, toys have a certain budget that's allotted to them to make sure that selling them is actually profitable. And for Transformers, that budget goes into things like R&D, parts count, production of the injection molds used to shape the raw materials, the cost of the raw materials themselves, like plastic and paint, and don't forget, every Transformer is essentially 3 toys: the robot, the alternate mode, and the puzzle in between. So in order to reduce costs, it's a good idea to reuse as much existing material as possible. And this has been been going on since the beginning, with characters like the Seekers all sharing the same basic design in different colors. And because it's been going on for 40 years, fans not only don't mind when this happens, some people will go out of their way to buy the same toy over and over again in different colors. The TF Wiki lists more than 30 versions of the classic Seeker mold made between 2006 and 2015. So with reusing elements of existing toys being such a common practice, often figures will be made with those alternate uses in mind from the start. Most often this means an alternate head sculpt is created alongside the main one to represent another character. More extensive retools happen as well, and thanks to the design team at Hasbro sharing a lot of behind-the-scenes posts on Instagram, we have a pretty good idea of what this process is actually like. A Voyager scale figure is made up of 9 different molds, usually separated by plastic type and color. And when a Voyager figure is chosen to be retooled into something else, it gets 4 new molds that it can use to change various aspects of the toy. In recent years, those 4 molds have sometimes been used to create entirely new figures. The Studio Series Optimus Prime figure for Rise of the Beasts was technically a retool of the character's toy from the Bumblebee movie, but it only ended up using the wheels and windows from the older figure, with every other part being made from that 4 mold retool budget. And bringing this back to our female characters, another example would be 2022's Voyager-class Legacy Override. She was initially intended to be a retool of the male character Hot Rod, but the designers were able to use those 4 new retool molds to create an entirely new toy. And while that's certainly impressive, Override is also the first female character to get a brand new figure with no shared parts at anything larger than a deluxe scale since Black Arachnia back in 1999, and Override's figure was made with a mold budget that's less than half of her male counterparts. The other Voyager-class female characters we've gotten since Black Arachnia are retools too, and there's never been a leader-class female character released at all. The only full-budget, original mold female character that's been released at anything larger than a deluxe price point since 1999 is the Titan-class Nemesis, which at first glance seems great. They're making a female character at the largest, most expensive size class possible. But then you glance again, and you notice that all of the other Titans since 2013 have had their hulking male robot modes front and center on the box. But the Nemesis box only shows her alternate mode. And while that alternate mode is the iconic Decepticon flagship from the Generation 1 cartoon, her Autobot counterpart didn't seem to think that was necessary to sell the toy. In fact, the only way someone could know that the character is female at all is if they'd been following Hasbro's fan streams during its development and release.
Donnie Mommy. Donnie Mommy.
So, despite having a seemingly high-profile female character on shelves, there was a lot of work done behind the scenes to downplay who she is. And that's why, even decades later, that mega-class Black Arachnia toy is still a big deal. Anyway. Right, the Beast Wars. An important thing to note about Beast Wars was that, despite being masterminded by Kenner in the US, it wasn't purely an American thing, and the Japanese side of the franchise had a big influence on what was to come in the early 21st century, because Japan had been operating the brand a little differently than America had. While the US still changed the toy line's gimmick annually, the overall brand identity of the Transformers tended to last for about 3 years at a time, so that they could target a specific group of kids and hold on to them for as long as possible before pivoting to the next upcoming batch. The original 3 years of cartoon, the 4 years after the cartoon ended, 3 years of Generation 2, 3 seasons of the Beast Wars cartoon, all helped to establish a pattern that still continues to this day. But in Japan, every year was treated like a new thing, with even the original cartoon's first 2 seasons being condensed into a single year, and season 3 being rebranded into the new Transformers 2010. This is kind of similar to how the Japanese source material for Power Rangers, Super Sentai, changes up its team every year, while the American show is more willing to hold on to its cast for multiple seasons and just give them new gimmicks to refresh the toy line. So in Japan, Transformers animations continued well beyond what was aired in America, with 4 separate annual shows carrying the torch for the rest of the first generation. And when the Beast era began in America, Takara did that again. To supplement the US Beast Wars stuff, Takara created Beast Wars 2nd and Beast Wars Neo, each with their own original anime series and toy lines to go along with them. Beast Wars 2nd was the most slapdash of the two, being a weird mishmash of American Beast Wars and Generation 2 toys that otherwise hadn't made it to Japan, with a few original molds sprinkled in for the major characters. Beast Wars Neo had a more robust original toy line, and it's one that's kind of become infamous since its release. Many of the Beast Wars Neo figures were based on animals that were unconventional for a boys' action toy line, and their robot modes were often ungainly and asymmetrical. And rather than truly transforming, a lot of them just exploded open to reveal a fully formed robot with pieces of an animal carcass hanging off of it. And the transformations to get them from one mode to the other could be pretty daunting considering they were part of a toy line that was designed for 5-year-olds. Supposedly, this particular round of toys sold so poorly that it impacted the sales of the next year's imported Transmetals figures, meaning that both the US and Japan decided to pivot the brand once again. With the Beast era having run its course, Hasbro and Takara then decided to team up and co-develop the next leg of the franchise in the early 2000s. But because toys and cartoons can't just materialize out of thin air, it would take a bit of time for this co-development to actually ramp up, especially because Beast Machines, America's follow-up to Beast Wars in the year 2000, only lasted a single year. This was partially due to this version of the franchise losing steam as the current generation of kids grew up and moved on. It was partially because the show was almost universally reviled, and it was partially because Hasbro was running into some financial trouble after they'd gambled on Jar Jar Mania sweeping the nation the previous year. So until Hasbro and Takara could come up with something to reinvigorate the Transformers brand again, we got the George Lazenby of the franchise, 2001's Robots in Disguise. Originally called Car Robots in Japan, named after the original Diaclone toy line, Robots in Disguise was part of a transition away from the animal-themed characters of the Beast Wars and back to the original vehicle-based roots of the brand. While Beast Machines saw the organic Maximals facing off against the futuristic new Viacon faction, Car Robots featured the return of the Autobots as protagonists, facing off against both the animalistic Predacons and the reintroduced vehicular Decepticons. The vast majority of the toy line was made up of redecos of older toys that could be made cheaply, but a few key heroes and villains did receive new figures along the way, with some having real licensed vehicles as their alternate modes. And because those new figures were spearheaded by Takara, they retained the complex transformations of their Beast Wars Neo predecessors. But that would change once 2002 debuted the result of Hasbro and Takara's co-development, Transformers Armada. With the super complex toys of the last few years not being a massive hit, the toy line went back to basics and focused on simpler, more intuitive toys with a strong play pattern that would entice kids to collect multiple figures. That play pattern was called Power Linksing, which primarily took the form of small collectible Transformers called Minicons that were able to plug themselves onto a larger toy to unlock new play features. The largest of these was Unicron. First seen in the animated Transformers movie from 1986, Unicron was a one-off Supreme class toy, and his appearance in Armada would make him the namesake of what would become known as the Unicron trilogy. And while he wasn't the largest Transformers figure in history, he was definitely bigger than anything currently available on the market. He had a light-up fist, plenty of play gimmicks, and his transparent purple shell was a far cry from the original character's muted blue tones. And despite being the first physical representation of an entity that fans had been wanting a toy of for over a decade at that point, it was clear that this was no prestige collector's item. It was a toy. And that might be obvious, aren't all Transformers toys? Yeah, but despite the brand constantly trying to keep pace with the latest generation of kids, many of those original fans stuck around, with large annual fan conventions starting to pop up in 1994, and the writers of Beast Wars even consulting with adult fans on message boards to make sure they had the lore straight. So alongside the Armada toy line, Hasbro began reconnecting with those older collectors, starting by creating the commemorative series of Generation 1 reissues in 2002. This was also the year that Hasbro began officially sponsoring the annual fan convention BotCon. New figures for older fans came in the form of alternators. Partially as a response to the futuristic vehicle modes of Armada, alternators consisted of robots that transformed into 1/24th scale contemporary licensed vehicles, complete with interior details like seats, steering wheels, and even recognizable engine parts. And despite only lasting for a few years, the Alternators toy line is a pretty important milestone for the brand. For one thing, the widespread use of licensed vehicles is something that would later become commonplace with toys based on the live-action movies, and the idea of making new toys of classic G1 characters started here as well, and then never stopped. But the Alternators figures were kinda clumsy and chunky, and some were just a pain to transform, so it wasn't really something that kids could get into. The Japanese equivalent to Alternators, called Vinyltech, went even further in the collector-oriented direction, giving the toys die-cast metal parts and additional paint applications. For the kids, the end of 2003 and most of 2004 saw the release of Transformers Energon. Now that Hasbro and Takara were working together to co-develop the main branch of the brand, there was also a combination of their particular approaches to it. Takara's Sentai-like annual refresh was combined with Hasbro's longer 3-year stints to give us a trio of thematically connected shows and toy lines. Energon was the second part of this trilogy, and its central gimmick was combination. This year's version of Optimus Prime could combine with a team of drones, and many other Autobots could top or bottom for each other as they coupled together to form more powerful robots. Unfortunately, the Decepticons were left out of the gimmick, so the line felt a lot less cohesive than its predecessor. But at least it had fan service. Because the bulk of the toy line was released during the franchise's 20th anniversary in 2004, a lot of the toys were designed as homages to classic characters, even if they couldn't share the same name. The first half of the Transformers history as a brand was messy. For one thing, the original batch of toys with real vehicle alternate modes didn't actually have the licenses to recreate those vehicles. Sideswipe and Sunstreaker were very obviously Lamborghinis, Ratchet and Ironhide were Nissan Vanettes, Bumblebee was a Volkswagen Beetle, Jazz wasn't just a Porsche race car, he was this Porsche race car. So obviously when they revisited these characters, those alt modes had to go, right? Well, not really, because for a long time Hasbro didn't revisit those characters. Sure, there would be an Optimus and a Megatron in every show or toy line, but those were different characters and the continuity was constantly refreshing itself. And for the first couple of decades of Transformers history, most characters' names were meaningless and applied almost randomly just because Hasbro needed to keep those names in circulation in order to maintain their trademark. And some characters can't be used at all. This guy should have been a new version of Bumblebee, but instead he's called Buzzsaw, a name taken from one of Soundwave's tapes who turns into a condor. This is because being called Bumblebee would make his name descriptive and a lot harder to defend in court. You can call a rhinoceros character Rhinox and trademark that because it's not descriptive, but when McDonald's did their Beast Wars Happy Meal promotion and included a generically named Rhino toy, his name was lacking that all-important trademark symbol despite it being present elsewhere in the promotion. And this lack of Bumblebee during the Beast Wars meant that by the time Hasbro got out of the Beast era and could actually name a character Bumblebee without it being descriptive, it had been so long since they used it that the trademark had lapsed and another toy company was able to secure it for their own unrelated Bumblebee-themed play equipment. So even though the Armada show and toy line wanted to include Bumblebee, they instead had to name the character Hotshot. And other characters continued to have random names applied as well, which sometimes caused problems down the line. This guy is colored to resemble the Generation 1 character Nightbeat, but he's not called that. Instead, Nightbeat is the name of his Minicon partner. His name is Sideswipe in the US, he's Stepper in Japan, and both of those are names that also belong to classic Generation 1 characters. But then a few months later, this guy was released, who looks like Generation 1 Sideswipe in Stepper's colors. But because they'd already used both of those names on the previous toy, he was called Wheeljack in the US and Rampage in Japan. And then that caused a problem a year later when this toy, designed to look like Generation 1 Wheeljack, came out. Because they'd already called the other guy Wheeljack in the US, they needed a new name for him, so he was called Downshift. But only in the US. Japan hadn't used the name Wheeljack yet in the Unicron trilogy, so they could just give him the name of the guy he looks like. But despite weird stuff like this, and despite the Energon toy line as a whole being seen as a step down from Armada, 2004 wasn't a bad year for Transformers. Or, at the very least, there was one very good thing about it. As the centerpiece of the franchise's 20th anniversary celebration, Hasbro and Takara developed a new version of Generation 1 Optimus Prime for the first time in, well, ever. Every other version of Optimus over the past 20 years had been a reinterpretation or a reinvention of a character from a new continuity, but this was the guy you remembered from 1984, fully realized like never before. Designed to fit in with the 1/24th scale alternators figures, he was huge with rubber tires, hefty die-cast metal parts, and a detailed posable sculpt. In Japan, he would be released as Masterpiece Optimus Prime, and the title wasn't unearned. This figure became the prototype for the next 2 decades of toys, for better or worse. See, even though there were definitely some missteps caused by the haphazard way the brand had been run for the first half of its life, it wasn't afraid to take chances and push things in interesting directions. It didn't always work, but things like Beast Wars and the Unicron trilogy are important pillars of the brand that revitalized it during slower periods and are beloved by the kids who grew up with them. But after 2 decades of constant transformation, the brand rediscovered Generation 1, and along with it, the safe, reliable cash flow of Generation 1 nostalgia. Optimus stopped being this guy, or this guy, or this guy, and just became this guy. Well, with one major exception. Before we can get to that exception, though, there is one more chapter of the Unicron trilogy to look at. Kind of. In Japan, the show and toy line known as Transformers Galaxy Force was a standalone series set in a new continuity that had nothing to do with the other Unicron trilogy shows or any other continuity that had come before. But in the US, that raw standalone material had to finish off the Unicron trilogy and make way for the upcoming live-action movie, so Hasbro did their best with what they called Transformers Cybertron. The main play pattern for this toy line was the Cyber Planet Keys, devices located on lost colonies that, like the minicons of Armada, could unlock additional abilities in whatever transformer they were plugged into. And the lore devised for this year's product helped to give the robots distinct flavors without being so eclectic that they abandoned theme entirely. Conventional robots and vehicle designs could be found in the Transformers of the planets Cybertron and Earth. Futuristic racing vehicles were tied to the Speed Planet. Toys reminiscent of the Beast Wars hailed from the Jungle Planet. Robots from the Giant Planet turned into huge industrial equipment, and the last survivors of Planet X were sleek, dangerous-looking spaceships. But the big thing that helped Cybertron bookend the trilogy was the first toy of the planet Cybertron itself, which turned into the Transformers god Primus, a robot that stood toe-to-toe with Armada's Unicron and had a transformation so epic that it required a special device beyond the standard Cyber Planet keys to unlock. All in all, not a bad way to go out, and with Primus being released in June 2006, it was just in time for the release of the live-action movie in November. But the movie didn't come out in November. It got pushed back to July 2007. So in order to keep the brand relevant until the movie came out, it needed something more classic. While the Masterpiece line took a few years to really add any new characters, Classics was a broader attempt to reinvent the Generation 1 cast for the 21st century. The lumbering T-Rex Grimlock was reimagined for a post-Jurassic Park world with a sleeker, more dynamic beast mode. Bumblebee, who was now being used without the safety net of trademarks thanks to his prominence in the upcoming movie, could no longer risk being an unlicensed Volkswagen Beetle, so instead turned into a generic 2-door hatchback. And Starscream received a downsized and simplified approximation of his Masterpiece figure, which came out the same year. And despite a lot of these characters looking pretty similar to how they did 20 years prior, for some fans, they weren't close enough, so they went to Japan. While there had always been differences between the Japanese and American versions of the toy lines, usually those differences took the form of entirely unique toys and characters. America never saw Big Convoy during the Beast Wars, and likewise, Japan never saw Will Smith's favorite character, Razor Beast.
Transformers! I've been looking for Razor Beast since like October!
Instead, Japan got Randy, whose golden hog was liable to crumble to dust in your hands due to being made of a notoriously brittle type of gold plastic. But throughout Robots in Disguise and the Unicron trilogy, the figures made by Hasbro and the figures made by Takara sometimes sported notable differences for what would otherwise be the same product. Hasbro's Classics line had a tendency to experiment with new decos for older characters, but Takara's Henkei line was a bit more slavish to the original looks and augmented their figures with a vacuum metallized finish to give them a more premium feel. They were also more expensive. Henkei Starscream sold for 2,200 yen in Japan, which was $19.53 in the US. Hasbro's version of the same toy was only $10 and didn't have any extra import fees on top of that. Some fans swore by Takara's more collector-focused product, which continued to be the standard in Japan for several more years, while other fans swore by the stuff they could actually go to the store and buy. And that was the only argument that Transformers fans would ever have. So then the Michael Bay movie came out. In 2007, this movie was Transformers. Sure, there was the debut of the Japanese Encore line of G1 reissues for people who really needed the warm blanket of nostalgia, and a few stragglers from other smaller toy lines, but 2007 really belonged to the movie, and it made the most of it. And I mean most. Characters were available in multiple toy lines at multiple size classes with multiple gimmicks, and even beyond the expected range of transforming robot toys, the movie received tons of merchandise that probably still lurks the dark corners of garage sales to this day. There was an upside to that though. Rather than trying to make one Optimus toy that would satisfy everyone, the character existed in forms that were tailored to specific demographics with specific features and varying levels of complexity. Collectors could get a version of the characters that were appropriate for them, while kids could still have things that were more obviously toys. They also had a brand new challenge with the way the characters were being designed. Unlike the way Transformers media had typically been made in the past, with the toys being created first and then adapted to the screen, the movie's concept artists were the ones to set the tone, which the toy designers then had to match. This resulted in a movie that radically reinvented what a Transformer could look like, much in the way Beast Wars had. So the designers had to find ways to strike that balance between the bold new look of the film with 20 years of toy engineering muscle memory. The movie's leader-class Optimus Prime strikes that balance pretty well, being a nice blend between the skeletal movie look and the classic Transformers aesthetic that might have helped to ease some naysayers into accepting the redesigns as a valid take on the characters. Another bit of connective tissue was the bevy of off-screen designs that helped to fill out the line. Some, like RC and Wreckage, were based on concept art for the film that went unused, but others, like Incinerator and Landmine, allowed the toy designers to adapt to the movie aesthetic without having to adhere to CGI character designs that were physically impossible to implement in plastic. And thanks to the movie's partnership with real-world vehicle manufacturers, the more kid-appeal automobiles of the Unicron trilogy were replaced by the real cars and trucks that had helped to make the early years of Generation 1 work so well in the first place. And as it turned out, this crucible of having to try and make the movie's insanely complex designs work in the real world had a huge effect on the toy line for the next few years. The first post-movie toy line was more or less business as usual. A spiritual successor to classics, 2008's Universe picked up where the previous line had left off, continuing to make new versions of older characters updated for the 21st century. The heavy-duty military aesthetic and realistic vehicle modes of the movie did shine through in Universe though, with out-there space cannon Galvatron being reimagined as a more conventional gray tank, and hopeless romantic Power Glide finding new life as a hulking slab of raw strength. The second test of the design team's post-movie capabilities was Transformers Animated. Like with the movie, the show's designs came first, but with lifelong Transformers fan Derek J. Wyatt bringing his design sensibilities with him from his previous work on shows like Teen Titans, the Transformers animated cast had almost the opposite problem from the film. Rather than trying to adapt overly complicated designs from digital assets with tens of thousands of parts, the toy designers had to find ways to make the show's simple, exaggerated, expressive 2D illustrations work in a physical 3D space. But they pulled it off. Following the movie's lead of making multiple versions of characters for both kids and collectors, when animated toys were good, they were good. Even characters like Rodimus, Lockdown, and Oil Slick, who only got brief appearances in the show, got well-received toys, and main characters like Optimus and Prowl weren't necessarily improved when they reappeared in the Legacy toy line a decade and a half later. Then in 2009, the design team was able to build on their experiences with the first movie and deliver some amazing figures for the follow-up, Revenge of the Fallen, with the new leader-class Optimus Prime being a particular standout. This thing embodies both the best and the worst of this era of Transformers. It's far more accurate to the source material than its predecessor and is a powerful, posable presence on any shelf, but it's an absolute nightmare to transform. Its complexity sacrifices grace, and Prime's iconic command to transform and roll out is then followed by 15 minutes of slowly putting his shoes on before he can head out the door. But aside from Prime being either your dream come true or your worst nightmare depending on what kind of person you are, the Revenge of the Fallen line was full of other toys that strike the balance between puzzle and play much better, while really bringing a lot of diversity to the Transformers lineup. The Scout class featured characters that turned into things like forklifts, toasters, and World War I biplanes, while the larger sizes provided new figures for fan-favorite characters like Lockdown and Bludgeon that were so good they crossed fandom barriers to become the de facto Generation 1 toys of those characters for more than a decade. The Revenge of the Fallen toy line even took advantage of the movie's vehicle sponsorships to create a spiritual successor to alternators called Human Alliance, with some figures being mini masterpieces at retail prices. And that energy continued into 2010 with 3 toy lines that blended the movie and G1 aesthetics in interesting ways. Hunt for the Decepticons created new characters to exist within the movie universe and added new versions of G1 characters that adopted the cinematic aesthetic. Generations continued more in the tradition of classics Henkei universe and began including characters from video games and comic books, and Reveal the Shield supplemented both, with new Generations-styled figures, re-releases of older universe and classics toys, and even some redecos of movie characters. Of those three toy lines, Generations would be the only one to carry its name forward, with the acronym CHUG becoming a fandom term to group it together with those earlier collector-focused toys. And since that initial group of figures in 2010, Generations has become the flagship line for the brand, and is probably what you're going to be looking at if you're interested in collecting Transformers at all. But the creation of a consistent, long-running line for collectors had an interesting side effect that split the franchise apart just as Hasbro was trying to pull it all together. With the movies being a massive success and the brand having survived 20 years of seat-of-the-pants driving, Hasbro decided to try and chart a long-term plan for Transformers, which developed into what's known as the aligned continuity. Rather than things like Beast Wars, the Unicron trilogy, or Animated having their own versions of the characters with their own lore, Hasbro wanted consistency across the brand. If you played as Optimus Prime in a video game, they wanted him to be the same guy on TV. And this kind of consolidation and unification was important to the brand, because it looked like the movie series was coming to an end with 2011's Dark of the Moon, and the movie toy line seemed to be winding down as well. Following the recession, fans were quick to notice that the third movie's toys didn't continue the increase in complexity that they'd seen from the previous films, and instead opted for slightly smaller, simpler figures with a heavier emphasis on gimmick-laden play accessories. There were still some great toys in the line. The new version of Ratchet had refined the character significantly from his lumpy inception in the first film. Starscream's new deluxe figure became the template for his appearance in the collector-focused Studio series years later, and sleeper hit off-screen characters like Skyhammer and Darksteel continued to expand the world of the movies beyond the borders of the film frame. But fans who were looking for another mainline refinement to leader-class Optimus Prime were a little disappointed by the movie's ultimate Optimus Prime toy, which took a few steps back in terms of accuracy to the movie and replaced a nuanced, complex transformation with a giant set of butterfly wings and Robert Downey Jr. heels. Toys designed to tie into the small screen were also a little disappointing. The new show, Transformers Prime, debuted in late 2010 and ran through 2011 alongside the third movie. This series was to be the flagship for not only the aligned continuity, but also Hasbro's new television network. And because the show and its accompanying lore were going to be the replacement for the films for a few years after Dark of the Moon, the series was aimed at an older audience than previous animated cartoons, so you'd think that the toys would be too. And Prime's first edition figures, a standalone wave of toys released in 2011, felt like a sigh of relief that things would be returning to normal after the brief blip of Dark of the Moon. But when the full Transformers Prime toy line, subtitled Robots in Disguise, was released in 2012, it became clear that wouldn't be the case. These toys were smaller and often less complex than the first edition figures, again owing to rising cost, recession-induced or otherwise, and Prime also continued the movie toy line's insistence on large, unwieldy accessories that some fans felt wasted the plastic budget of the toys. Not to say there weren't some good figures in the line. The Robots in Disguise version of the Viacon is much better than its first edition counterpart and is a truly amazing achievement in toy engineering, creating a slender, lithe robot mode by folding up an entire car and compacting it neatly inside the robot's shins. This line's version of Wheeljack is also an incredibly dynamic figure, and Soundwave was exactly as sleek and menacing as his on-screen counterpart. But there were also some other changes happening too, starting with Dark of the Moon. The Scout size class, which had been responsible for some of the most interesting Transformers toys over the past few years, was discontinued and replaced with the Cyberverse line, a range of smaller, simplified toys that were designed to interact with larger playsets. The Cyberverse play pattern continued through Prime up until 2013's Beast Hunters rebrand, where it was joined by new, brightly colored Predacons, as well as updated versions of the existing Prime characters who sported garish, spiky new looks and wielded outlandish weapons. The Japanese side of the toy line tended to tone down some of the more extreme decos these later figures receive. Well, mostly. One of my favorite figures from this line is Takar's version of Beast Hunter's Ratchet. In the show and the initial toy line, Ratchet's look was fairly restrained, since he was a pretty straight-laced character, but Beast Hunters reimagined him as seemingly an homage to Beast Wars Dinobot, with his pack-in weapon being similar to the original Dinobot's tail weapon, and his face and torso resembling the Transmetal 2 clone of Dinobot. When Japan got their hands on the mold, they then took inspiration from the one episode of the show where Ratchet was forced to work for the Decepticons and just made him a Decepticon, even giving him a new deco reminiscent of his colors from the live-action movies. Another big change Japan made to the Prime toy line was trying to market it more to the model kit community. Rather than paint applications, a lot of Japanese Prime figures required you to apply stickers to the characters, and rather than their normal pack-in weapon, they came with ARMS Microns, collectible minifigures / model kits that could transform into weapons to be wielded by the larger toys. You want Megatron to turn into a gun again? Well, here he is. Japan even got their own unique animated series for the first time since Beast Wars, opting not to air the third season of Prime and instead creating Triple Combination Transformers Go. This show was a lot lighter in tone than Prime and featured the brand new Autobot Swordbot teams who could combine with each other in multiple configurations and faced off against the 4 Oni, redecos of Prime's Predacons with new demonic head sculpts and gorgeous metallic colors. Outside of Japan, the Transformers Prime toy line wrapped up with a series of figures that were yet another step down in complexity and were in fact just upscaled Cyberverse Commander figures with a few new modifications. This gradual kitification of Transformers Prime was then cemented by its sequel series, Robots in Disguise, not to be confused with the previous show's toy line, the other animated series, or even the IDW published comic book that was running at the time. And rather than growing up with the kids who were watching Prime, Robots in Disguise reset to a younger audience, the kids who had been watching Rescue Bots. Rescue Bots, which was part of the larger aligned continuity, was designed as an entry-level Transformers experience, with its toys being made for kids as young as 3 years old, while the rest of the toy line had historically been for ages 5 and up. The show and toy line ran concurrently with Prime, and when those 3 to 5-year-olds had gotten too old for the preschool show, Robots in Disguise became their next step up. The incoming group of toddlers then had their own new series with Rescue Bots Academy, a spin-off of the original Rescue Bots cartoon. So this new Robots in Disguise became a sort of stepping stone to Generations, with the toy line swapping out the traditional deluxe class figures for the new simplified Warrior class. And this new dynamic was reflected in the brand's overall toy packaging. Rescue Bot Stuff was marked as being for ages 3 and up, Robots in Disguise was for ages 6 and up, and Generations was now for fans and collectors ages 8 and up. And despite that change, and despite some fans being understandably disappointed that the sequel series to Prime seemingly wasn't actually made for the people who watched Prime, a lot of the toys were still pretty good, especially the line's Decepticons, which adopted animalistic traits to create unique characters like the deer-themed tractor/mobster Thunderhoof and the googly-eyed lobster race car Bisque. And if you had access to Japan's version of the toy line, Transformers Adventure, some figures got unique decos or alternate tooling to help bridge the gap with Generations even more. But despite still being the more premium collector-focused toy line, Generations wasn't really what it once was either. In 2012, the Generations toy line was exclusively focused on figures for the new video game Fall of Cybertron, which was also branded as being part of the aligned continuity. A few figures from the first game in the series, War for Cybertron, were included in the first year of Generations in 2010, and put beside their predecessors, a lot of the new toys didn't really measure up. Even Bruticus, a massive robot composed of 5 smaller Decepticons, was noticeably malnourished compared to his in-game counterpart, and he was supposed to be the year's big draw. 2013 would start to remedy this a bit, with Generations gaining the oddly titled Thrilling 30 branding for a couple of years, which was designed to celebrate the franchise's 30th birthday in 2014. This rebrand also marked the first major aesthetic change for the line. Classics, up through the first year of Generations, had been primarily concerned with Transformers for grown-ups, stripping away the more fanciful elements of the characters in favor of stern, modernized designs that took the characters seriously. Maybe a bit too seriously. He's supposed to be the funny one. But instead, Thrilling 30 leaned more heavily into the futuristic, stylized designs featured in the current IDW comic books, issues of which were packed in with the toys for a little cross-promotion. Characters like Bumblebee and Megatron received slick new toys that may have been more style than substance, but that just allowed other long-ignored characters like Springer to effortlessly take the spotlight instead, and the line even revisited characters from nearly nostalgic chapters of the franchise like Beast Wars and even Beast Machines. Thrilling 30 also saw the introduction of Windblade, a character created by fans through a series of online polls. And maybe because Hasbro saw people specifically asking for more female characters to be created, Windblade would also be joined by RC, who made her debut as a major character in 1986 but had never received a proper toy, and Chromia, who appeared even earlier and had been similarly neglected by the franchise. The biggest debut in Thrilling 30, though, has to be the Titan-class Metroplex. Standing 2 feet tall, this guy was, at the time of his release, the largest Transformer toy ever made. He had 3 different modes, lights and sounds, and could do your laundry. And since then, Titans have become an annual staple of the line. Most of them aren't as big as Metroplex, but after a decade of Titans, being big isn't really a selling point on its own anymore. At the other end of the scale, the Cyberverse play pattern was nowhere to be found in Generations and was replaced by Legends class toys. Smaller and more simple than their predecessors in the Scout class, these figures were another stab at trying to maintain a pocket money size class, something that's become harder and harder as prices have continued to rise since the 80s. And aside from Thrilling 30, 2014 also expanded the Generations line to include movie figures for the first time. Unlike the previous 3 films, Age of Extinction divided its toys into 2 separate lines, one for younger kids with simpler gimmick-filled toys called Robots in Disguise, again, and one with the expected, more complex figures for older kids and collectors, which bore the Generations branding. But despite that, there was still something off about them. Many of the robots, including the newly featured Dinobots, sported worn and muted color palettes in the film, but their toy counterparts were so garishly colored that sometimes they looked like dollar store knockoffs. And thanks to the movie redesigning the characters to have less physical vehicle parts in their robot modes, a number of toys struggled to translate the already difficult movie designs into plastic. But it wasn't all bad for collectors. Even though the movie figures were a shadow of their former selves and the mainline Generations toys were seeing cut corners, the Masterpiece line was more than pulling its weight. I haven't really talked much about the Masterpiece line yet because it kind of exists in its own realm apart from the wider Transformers environment. While most Transformers toys are co-developed by both Hasbro and Takara Tomy, Masterpiece is more of a Japan-centric thing, with some figures not even getting releases in Hasbro territories. It has its own release schedule, its own aesthetic, and even its own scale, with characters usually being about one size bracket larger than their Generations counterparts. We already know that the line kicked off with Masterpiece Optimus Prime for the 20th anniversary, but it was a little slow to grow from there. The second Masterpiece figure came out in 2005, and it was just a white redeco of Optimus, inspired by the white Optimus Prime toy that lived inside Ultra Magnus's power armor. Starscream would be the first new mold for the series in 2006, with Megatron still retaining his gun alt mode coming along in 2007. Redecos of Starscream as Thundercracker and Skywarp would follow over the next year, and 2009 introduced a Masterpiece version of the Dinobot Grimlock. The last of these sporadic releases would be Rodimus Prime in 2011, but the line would reboot itself later that same year with a brand new Masterpiece Optimus Prime. See, despite the line's name, a lot of the early Masterpiece figures were very experimental. Optimus was designed to fit in with a line of licensed scale cars and trucks, and Starscream likewise focused more on trying to make a realistic jet mode than being slavishly accurate to a 40-year-old animation model. Megatron struggled to create something that resembled the character's iconic look in the animation and comic books, and is a notoriously fiddly toy that doesn't really have the articulation to make that effort worthwhile. But MP10, the new Optimus Prime, would learn the lessons of its predecessors and refine the big clunky MP1 into a sleek and athletic, if somewhat smaller, masterpiece that would set the standard of the line for the next several years. And from there, things really kicked off. Rather than a new mold every couple of years with a redeco or two in between, every year saw several new figures released. And in order to continue putting out new toys without having to make a ton of new expensive molds, the Masterpiece line did something very interesting. It created brand new Generation 1 characters. Even though the Japanese Diaclone toy line was heavily mined for toys to fill out the original 1984 Transformers roster, not every Diaclone mech was turned into a Transformer, and some that did become Transformers had their colors altered for their Western release. So, in 2015, the Masterpiece line debuted Exhaust, a brand new character based on a Diaclone toy that was never released in the US but shared a basic mold with Wheeljack. A few characters, like Road Rage from the same year as Exhaust, had some established presence in the brand via old Japanese retailer exclusive redecos of Generation 1 figures, but several, like Corden, Reboost, and Rigorous, were brand new classic characters. And shortly after the release of Exhaust and Road Rage, Masterpiece began to branch out beyond Generation 1 and into Beast Wars, with figures that were so accurate to the cartoon that Cheetor even has low-resolution spots to match the low-res digital model from the show. The live-action movies would also start to get Masterpiece figures in 2017. While a couple of mainline leader-class figures had been sold as movie masterpieces in 2010, new mold Masterpiece figures of big-screen characters didn't take off for several years. The broadening of the Masterpiece aesthetic also featured a change in the main Masterpiece line as well, with more focus on accuracy to the cartoon for Generation 1 characters. This prompted another round of updates for characters like Optimus, Megatron, and Starscream alongside new animation-accurate molds, but that might be coming to an end too. In 2022, the MPG toy line was created as a spin-off to Masterpiece and spent the first 3 years of its life assembling Raiden, the first Masterpiece combiner whose constituent parts were the Japanese-exclusive Generation 1 Trainbots. And the standard Masterpiece line was retired with Jinrai, the Optimus Prime lookalike from 1988's Japanese-exclusive show Transformers Master Force. Looking ahead, 2025's God Bomber, who becomes Jinrai's trailer, will be the first new mold in the MPG line, and it's going to be joined by redecos and retools of older Masterpiece figures. Beyond that though, we don't really know what the Masterpiece line will hold, so if you're thinking of getting into collecting Masterpiece figures now, you may find yourself being priced out by the already expensive figures getting heavily marked up due to age and scarcity. I don't think this part of the franchise is a total dead end, but for right now at least, it might be a good idea to pump the brakes a bit and see what's coming around the bend first. Or just stick with the Hasbro stuff. After Thrilling 30, the Generations line began what's become a tradition over the past decade and started doing 3-year phases of thematically connected annual toy lines. The first of these was the Prime Wars trilogy, which started with Combiner Wars in 2015. In the Generation 1 toy line, many combining figures consisted of a large robot torso with 4 smaller robot limbs that could be arranged in any configuration or even swap with other combiners. And Combiner Wars returned to that concept with the benefit of 30 years of toy engineering and brand momentum, guaranteeing toys that far surpassed their original versions. But despite that, it soon became clear that the individual figures were being compromised to support the overall line's play pattern. In order to be universally compatible, all the deluxe-sized figures needed to be very similar in size and configuration so they could serve as either an arm or a leg, and structurally sound enough to hold a pose or support the weight of the gestalt, leading to some less than stellar proportions. The Voyager-class torsos could get away with a bit more individuality as long as the arm and leg slots were balanced, but even then they started to get samey after repeated use. However, the upside to sharing molds and engineering across multiple figures meant that they were able to do a lot of them. As I mentioned before, a yearly Transformers toy line will normally have about 4 waves of figures. Combiner Wars lasted for 6 waves, and supplemented the classic teams by giving combiner functionality to older characters who hadn't had it before, and even created new members of those classic teams in order to get the most out of each mold. It also allowed for some really obscure pulls that probably wouldn't have seen the light of day otherwise, with long-lost behemoths like Computron and Lio Kaiser getting their first updates in decades. The line also included another fan vote character with Victorion, the first female combiner. That led to Japan giving Victorion a Decepticon counterpart called Megatronia, and they also had a very different take on the line overall. While most figures in the West were sold individually, prompting kids and collectors to pick and choose the robots to create their own combiner teams, Japan opted to sell them exclusively in expensive collector-focused box sets, with new characters like Rook and Alpha Bravo being replaced by their team's original members. After Combiner Wars wrapped up, the next phase of the Prime Wars trilogy was Titan's Return, which integrated the large Titan-scale figures, which there were 2 of during this line, more fully into the rest of the toy line by using small figures called Titan Masters. This line was largely inspired by the back half of Generation 1, which leaned heavily into various small master types of Transformers. Each figure in the line came with a Titan Master that could transform into the robot's head as well as drive the vehicle or interact with their weapons, while an assortment of unique Titan Masters were sold separately and could be combined with their accessories to become more fully fledged figures of their own. To supplement the play pattern even further, the larger Leader and Titan-class toys had additional base modes that allowed them to become playsets for the Titan Masters. And in addition to a pretty robust play pattern, the second year of the Prime Wars also had a lot more variation than its predecessor, with a lot fewer reused molds. The only really disappointing aspect of this year's toy line were the Voyager class figures. For whatever reason, each of this year's Voyager class toys had a triple changing gimmick, allowing them to turn into 2 separate alternate modes. Triple changers had been a part of the Transformers since the first generation, but they were very tricky to pull off, and more often than not ended up with at least one mode sacrificed to make the others look good. The Titans Return triple changers made a valiant effort, but it was usually obvious which one was the main mode and which one was the afterthought. The second oddity with the Voyagers was how they handled the Titan Masters. Because they were designed for deluxe figures and had to be compatible across the toy line, the larger figures had to find ways to bulk them up to avoid becoming pinheads. The leader toys used full helmets to disguise how small the Titan Masters were, but the Voyagers just gave them bigger ears or stacked some stuff next to the heads or gave them really pathetic masks. The third problem with the Voyagers was the stickers. While the original Transformers toys did come with sticker sheets that you could apply to your figures, they hadn't been used prominently in a really long time, and Titans Return featured pre-applied foil stickers that made the Voyager decos feel cheaper than even the less expensive deluxes. But that was only for a year. And that's the beauty of Transformers. If you don't like what's on the shelves, just wait a year and it'll be different. Wait 3 years and it'll be something else entirely. Except with the third phase of the Prime Wars called Power of the Primes. Rather than doing something new, this line decided to combine aspects from the previous 2 years by doing new combiners whose hands and feet could fit the newly renamed Prime Masters inside them. Except now, instead of the Prime Masters being the robots' heads, they were little blocks of stuff that lived inside small shells reminiscent of the late Generation 1 Pretenders. And the reuse of older gimmicks combined with only having 3 waves instead of the 6 from Combiner Wars or 5 from Titans Return or even the standard 4 made Power of the Primes feel like a bit of an underwhelming finish for a trilogy that was itself a little rocky. At this point, it was time for a change of pace. While the Prime Wars trilogy had some good play gimmicks and freshened up some classic characters by presenting them in new contexts, fans were eager to go back to basics. They wanted a toy line where a robot could turn into a car, and that was good enough. The whole Transformers franchise was entering a period of transition in the late 2010s. Power of the Primes ended the Prime Wars trilogy in 2018, with the next phase of the toy line beginning a year later. The Transformers comics by IDW, which had been running since 2005, decided to end their ongoing continuity in 2018 and rebooted it with a brand new storyline in 2019. And like so many of its predecessors, Robots in Disguise ended after 3 seasons in 2017. A new series called Transformers Cyberverse then began the following year, continuing the trend of animated shows aimed at younger audiences with toy lines to match. Cyberverse was also not in the aligned continuity. That experiment was slowly fizzling out, with its sole remaining story, Rescue Bots Academy, ending in 2020. 2017 also saw the release of The Last Knight, the final Transformers live-action movie directed by Michael Bay. The toy line for the movie was itself a bit of a transition, with the collector-focused movie toys being branded as Premiere Edition figures, a move that was accompanied by a change in packaging style. Generally, toys are released in one of 2 ways, in boxes or on cards contained in little plastic bubbles. Larger, more expensive figures were always boxed, but deluxes had remained on cards since their introduction all the way back in 1996. But then, Hasbro created the Star Wars Black Series toy line in 2013. And as a more premium figure line focused on the collector market, these toys came in windowed boxes rather than on cards. Hasbro's collector-focused Marvel Legends toys would make the jump from cards to boxes a couple of years later, and Transformers would start putting all of its collector-focused toys, including deluxes, into boxes starting with the Premiere Edition. And the toy lines that followed this decision definitely had a different feeling from what had come before. The first to follow the Premiere Edition's lead would be the Studio Series. While the Premiere Edition had kind of been its own thing, the Studio Series was officially under the Generations banner and adopted a sleek packaging style reminiscent of the Black Series that definitely signaled these were more collectibles than toys. And as its name would suggest, the Studio Series focused on characters from the live-action films. Its first year, in 2018, contained characters from every film released to date, with the exception of The Last Knight, whose Premiere Edition toys were kind of honorary Studio Series figures at the time. Many molds from the Premiere Edition even found their way into the Studio Series line proper. Even the brand new Bumblebee movie got in on the Studio Series action, and it became clear that from now on, the collector-focused toys from any new films would be here, while the stuff branded with the movie's logo and colors would be for younger kids. And one of the unique aspects introduced in the Studio series was an attempt at consistent scale. Scale has always been a bit of an afterthought in Transformers. One of the tallest of the 80s Autobots was Blaster, who turned into a miniature boombox but towered over trucks and airplanes. The gigantic Dinobots had last been seen as deluxes, while the diminutive Scout Bumblebee had gotten hulking leader-class figures in the past owing to his popularity on the big screen. So for the Studio series, the toy line tried to keep things more or less in line with what was depicted in the movies. Bumblebee was a small character, so he got a small figure. Lockdown was taller, and so was his toy. Both were deluxes, but were very different sizes. From here on out, classifications like Deluxe, Voyager, and Leader became a price point rather than a size class. This idea would carry on into the next phase of the ongoing Generations line in 2019, the War for Cybertron trilogy, which had nothing to do with the video game, and instead was a condensed retelling of the original Generation 1 story. And while Deluxes and Voyagers could still generally be counted on to be fairly distinct in their sizes, Leaders now use the extra budget afforded by the price point in other ways, like giving Ultra Magnus a trailer that could become a suit of power armor, or by creating a triple-changing Astro Train that wasn't as limited as previous Voyager and Deluxe-sized attempts. The first act of the trilogy was called Siege, and was heavily inspired by the opening minutes of the Generation 1 cartoon's first episode. This sequence briefly glimpsed the characters on their home planet of Cybertron before they traveled to Earth, so the characters turned into appropriately alien-looking vehicles. However, their robot mode character models still sported extremely prominent Earth mode kibble. The Siege toy line chose to follow this incongruity and gave its characters very familiar looking robot modes that transformed into futuristic vehicles that just so happened to look like cars and trucks from Earth. Siege also became a lot more restrained in its use of toy gimmicks than the Prime Wars trilogy was. Instead of universal combining or head-swapping robots, Siege leaned away from play and more towards display, with increased articulation leading to once luxurious features like ankle tilts becoming more standardized, and new interchangeable fire blast effects allowing collectors to create frozen-in-time battle dioramas. But that doesn't mean kids were left out entirely. The modular trend of Prime Wars was continued with the Weaponizers, Transformers inspired by obscure 80s robot Six Gun, who was made of 6 guns. While the Weaponizers functioned as self-contained Transformers on their own, they could also be pulled apart to add extra firepower to the other combatants. The micro-scale play pattern of the Titan Masters also continued with the reintroduction of Micromaster Transformers, who were just the right size to interact with that year's Titan, Omega Supreme. This year also introduced the new $90 Commander price point, a name that had previously been used in the small Cyberverse line, but now referred to big toys that stood somewhere between Leaders and Titans. The inaugural Commander was Jetfire, whose Generation 1 figure was just a Macross Valkyrie with an Autobot sticker, but was now designed much more closely to his animation model, which had initially been changed to avoid a lawsuit with Macross's rights holders. And this made Jetfire the vanguard of a new design philosophy for the toy line. Rather than reinventing or reinterpreting characters as the previous figures had done, Siege, like the Studio series, was focused on replication. And this became more apparent with the second part of the trilogy, called Earthrise. As the name would suggest, Earthrise focused on the characters taking on Earth-based alternate modes, and based the toys much more heavily on the animation models from the Generation 1 cartoon and 1986 movie. Characters without notable appearances in animation like Double Dealer were instead high-definition updates of their original toys, complete with the awkward proportions necessitated by the limitations of 80s toy technology. Earthrise also followed up the Siege Weaponizers by introducing modulators based on old 80s Transformers playsets. Kingdom would then follow Earthrise in 2021, replacing modulators with the new Fossilizers, who, for the first time, were new characters that didn't have deep-cut origins and were just cool skeleton dinosaur robots. Alongside the Fossilizers, Kingdom also introduced the new Core class, the latest in the lineage of Basic Scout, Cyberverse Commanders, and Legends class figures. It's also a size class without a real identity. While you can reliably expect a car to be a Deluxe, a truck to be a Voyager, and a truck with a trailer to be a Leader, Core figures are a real grab bag. Sometimes they're characters that are too small to be a Deluxe, but too complex to be a pack and accessory. Sometimes they're just smaller versions of popular characters. Sometimes they're representatives of odd corners of the franchise that are too risky at higher price points. And sometimes they're just random characters that the designers wanted to do but didn't have room for anywhere else. But right now, it seems like the core class is being reduced to an as-needed price point, with seemingly less obligation to fill out an entire year's worth of figures with a bunch of random names, and more focus on actually small-scale characters. I think it's a decent niche for the size class, but given the history of below deluxe price points, we'll see if it sticks around. So with the core class becoming more of a supplementary thing, the bulk of the Kingdom toy line was geared towards finishing the Generation 1 recap by adding more characters from the 1986 movie for its 35th anniversary, as well as several characters from Beast Wars to celebrate its 25th birthday. And this whole double anniversary had an interesting effect on Generations as a whole. While it's never been officially confirmed, there's a fan theory out there that suggests that the Beast Wars anniversary toys were a late addition to the toy line, and that the third leg of the War for Cybertron trilogy was supposed to be almost exclusively an anniversary line for the 1986 movie. That would make sense. War for Cybertron was a condensed retelling of G1, and Beast Wars, while something of a G1 prequel, was removed by either hundreds or millions of years from that core Generation 1 story, depending on how you measure time travel. The main evidence for this theory is Studio Series 86. Starting in 2021, the Studio Series, which had up until this point been exclusively for new toys of characters from the live-action films, branched off to include characters from the 1986 animated movie as well. There were 10 characters from the 1986 movie included in 2021's Studio Series lineup, and 11 Beast Wars characters in Kingdom. And while it's not an exact match, it is close enough to suggest that maybe those 1986 figures initially had a different home. But whether or not that theory is true, Studio Series 86 did get created for the movie's anniversary and gave the Studio Series more room to expand beyond its initial purpose, which is good, since a COVID-induced 5-year gap between live-action movies and a limited amount of pre-existing characters meant that the line needed to do something to ensure its longevity. And with movie studios owning the designs for the digital assets featured in their films, Hasbro designers have mentioned that they actually need to license the movie bots from Paramount, adding more hurdles when it comes to making toys of characters from movies that are years past their relevance. So the Studio Series would continue to branch out again in 2023, with Gamer Edition figures based on the War for Cybertron video game, and 2024 is bringing to life characters only featured in concept art for the movies. And although a varied product line is a good thing for the overall longevity of the Studio Series, it does mean that people looking to collect a specific group of characters are having to wait longer, as there's less room in the toy line to accommodate every on-screen version of the Transformers. And even when they try to make everyone happy, there's still some oddities that pop up from time to time. So, in 2024, the Studio Series created new figures of the Autobots Sideswipe and Sunstreaker. The Generation 1 versions of these characters were said to be brothers, since they had nearly identical Lamborghini alternate modes. So great, the brothers are back. Except Sideswipe is the version of the character from the War for Cybertron video game, while Sunstreaker is based on unused concept art for the Bumblebee movie. So they're more like interdimensional cousins. If you want a modern version of those characters that are actually designed to go together, you would have to go back to the War for Cybertron trilogy. But there's still an issue. Siege Sideswipe has a futuristic Cybertronian vehicle mode, while Earthrise Sunstreaker turns into a copyright-dodging Lamborghini. Sideswipe did get retooled with his own Earth-based Lumbo alternate mode in the Kingdom toy line, but in order to get it, you needed to buy an Amazon-exclusive 2-pack that came with Sideswipe and Beast Wars 2nd Skywarp, a character whose main notable feature is that he combines with 2 other robots to form a giant Maximal Warrior, and now combines with nobody to form nothing. But maybe you don't feel like shelling out for a multi-pack that comes with a toy you don't want. Well, Sunstreaker got released in Combiner Wars, but there was no Sideswipe. Sideswipe had a Fall of Cybertron toy, but not Sunstreaker. The last time Sideswipe and Sunstreaker were released as mainline figures at the same time as part of the same universe was all the way back in 2008. But to be fair, the toy line has a lot of ground to cover, like in 2022 with the release of Legacy, a 3-year celebration of the 40th anniversary of Transformers. Unlike the Prime Wars focus on characters with specific gimmicks, or the War for Cybertron trilogy's internal narrative, Legacy, with its 2nd and 3rd year sublines Evolution and United, took the Game Master Anthony approach and tried to get as many facets of Transformers history represented as possible, with some mixed results. Although each character's packaging often sported a mention of which part ignored the franchise they hailed from, Legacy's attempt to create a best-of line for the anniversary meant that toys were amalgamations of several different sources. Sometimes this worked well. Windblade, despite being labeled as the Cyberverse version of the character, filled in that show's broad shapes with details from the character's original appearances in Thrilling 30 and the IDW comics. Some were less elegant, though. Bulkhead, who is billed as being from Transformers Prime, doesn't actually share an alternate mode with his counterpart from that show. Instead, he turns into a six-wheeled military truck that's reminiscent of animated Bulkhead, while also seemingly drawing inspiration from Age of Extinction's Hound, who's basically Bulkhead under another name. This has the overall effect of squaring off the silhouette of the iconically round Bulkhead and making him not feel much like either version of the character. The line's goal of touching every part of the brand's history also means that some figures are genericized in order to make them suitable for as many different characters as possible. Prime Bulkhead's castmate RC received a figure of herself in the first wave of Legacy, and aside from also turning into a motorcycle, her resemblance to the character from the show is primarily limited to her head sculpt and the overall colors of the toy. Who she does resemble is Generation 2 Road Rocket, who got a new toy in the same year as RC. The original Road Rocket toy was also supposed to get reused in Generation 2 as the Laser Cycle Jazz, and wouldn't you know it, that cancelled figure finally got an appearance in 2023 as a redeco of Road Rocket. The RC version of the mold would also get redecoed into Flamor, a character who originated as a tongue-in-cheek redeco of RC from Transformers Energon. Then the Legacy figure would get retooled again to serve as Ariel, the pre-war identity of Optimus Prime's girlfriend Elita 1. That doesn't mean that every Legacy figure was mined for endless redecos and retools though. As a counterpoint to Combiner Wars, Legacy created a new version of Menasor, using the Commander-class Motormaster as an exoskeleton for the Deluxe-class Stunticons to attach to in a specific configuration. It might have been a little too bespoke, though. Despite most of the team being released in 2022, Breakdown was pushed into the first wave of 2023's Legacy Evolution, resulting in the character being frustratingly difficult to find. And those 2023 figures would also include the Junkions. After being absent from the first year of Legacy, 2023 would bring back the mix-and-match pull-apart figures from the War for Cybertron trilogy, drawing inspiration from the piecemeal garbage people introduced in the 1986 animated movie. But while the studio series focused on existing Junkions like Wreck-Gar, Legacy followed in the footsteps of Kingdom's fossilizers by creating all new Junkion characters. 2024's Legacy United would then branch out even further with the Armorizers, new characters that were a triple threat deep cut reference to single episode rock creatures from the Japanese Headmaster series, the GoBot spin-off Rock Lords, and the non-Transformer Hasbro toy line, the Inhumanoids. After nearly 15 years, it finally feels like the Generations line is earning that S at the end of its name. And that S in Generations is really important to keep in mind if you want to get into Transformers, because the vast majority of it isn't going to be for you. And that's great, because you can, and probably should, just ignore a lot of it. Those cheap-looking toys for babies are for babies. The kiddie cartoons are for kids. Kiss Players is for perverts. And in a few years, there will be a bunch of new stuff for a bunch of different people. And that also means that if you're jumping into Transformers as an adult who used to be into it as a kid, something from your childhood is probably still in play somewhere. In a recent interview, John Warden, the current design director for Transformers at Hasbro, said that he believes in a 14-year nostalgia curve when it comes to revisiting older characters. 14 years ago was the start of the Aligned continuity. And right now, we're starting to see a resurgence in stuff from that era, with many characters from the early 2010s making new appearances on toy shelves. And based on what we know about upcoming toys, the next few years of Generations may be focusing heavily on lore established in the Aligned continuity. And if you're interested in Transformers as someone who's never interacted with the franchise at all before, its constant evolution means that despite its vast history, it's incredibly friendly to newcomers. Every few years, you're going to find a new TV show, movie, toy line, comic series that's either just started or is just about to start, and even the things that are in full swing or just wrapping up don't have decades of story baggage to catch up with. So just pick up a comic book off the shelf, wander into a movie theater, or see what's streaming somewhere. Every Transformers experience is going to be someone's first, and the franchise is designed to accommodate that. I originally wanted this video to answer the question, where do I start with Transformers for new fans? And after a way too long examination of the brand's entire history, the answer being wherever you want might seem a little vague and unhelpful. You might have some more specific questions, and I've seen a lot of those questions from new fans or people who are just bot curious that get asked again and again online. Some of them are broad, some of them are very specific, but I'm going to try and answer some of the more common ones here at the end of the video. Wait, why do I still have 13 pages left of the script? Up until now, I haven't really talked that much about the actual narrative content of the franchise. For the majority of the brand's life, it was centered around toys made by a toy company, and the media usually just existed to support the sale of those toys. But with the massive success of the movies, the brand shifted to become a broader intellectual property that puts a lot more emphasis on the stories being told rather than just the toys being sold. 2023's Rise of the Beasts would have been seen by around 36 million people in theaters, and according to Hasbro's end-of-year earnings call, that also meant a 35% increase in toy sales compared to years that didn't have a movie. So these stories are very important to the franchise, and a lot of fans might have no interest in the toys whatsoever, but are still interested in learning more about the world of the Transformers and the characters that inhabit it. And if you are one of those people, an important thing to know is that those stories, that world and its characters, are rarely consistent or even connected. Something you might have gleaned from the history lesson is that Transformers tends to just ditch whatever it's doing every few years and start fresh, which means that the vast majority of stories have nothing to do with each other. And while there was a kind of loose continuity up through the end of the 90s, it was still pretty scattershot. Back in the 80s, the cartoons told a different story from the comics, and even the Japanese shows completely ignored the end of the American cartoon and did their own thing for a few years. There's massive swings in quality, too. The American Generation 1 cartoon, while important, is a cheap toy commercial show from the 80s. There are definitely a number of episodes that are still relevant to the franchise today, like War Dawn, which is the closest the cartoon ever came to telling the story featured in Transformers 1, but don't feel like you have to slog through nearly 100 episodes of questionable animated content. If the show doesn't grab you, maybe just watch the first few episodes to get a feel for the characters and the backstory, and then skip ahead to the 1986 animated movie. It's more mature than the TV show, but doesn't entirely lose that sense of kids' cartoon silliness and is a great capsule of what Transformers was in the 80s. Season 3 of the cartoon continues the sci-fi vibe of the movie, but with a lower budget and less famous voice actors. And the Japanese shows can be pretty hard to get a hold of these days, so you probably don't need to worry about them unless you're really deep into Transformers or want to know who, like, Metal Hawk is. Beast Wars, aside from the limitations of 90s computer animation, holds up pretty well from a writing perspective. The expense of making the show meant that the writers had to whittle the cast down to a much smaller size than the Generation 1 cartoon, and they had more time to develop the characters and their stories. And while it is broadly a sequel to Generation 1, it blends backstory and lore from both the cartoons and the comics, so it isn't really a sequel to either one and is still largely its own thing. And like with G1, you can probably skip the Japanese Beast Wars stuff as well as Beast Machines and Robots in Disguise. The Unicron trilogy is a bit of a mixed bag. The awkward nature of the American-Japanese co-production meant that a lot of the time the episodes were really rushed. The second series, Energon, is particularly maligned by fans, and Cybertron had to use the dub to staple the show onto the end of the trilogy after Japan decided to make it a standalone series. Starscream's character arc in Armada is pretty well remembered, so it might be worth checking out for that, but the follow-ups would just bring him back to square one, so you may not want to continue beyond that. Transformers Animated is the first Transformers show where the inmates are running the asylum. It's got tons of Easter eggs and references for fans familiar with G1, but it also has a lot of new takes on the material that could surprise longtime viewers. Unfortunately, that also means that it might not be the best choice for your first Transformers show. While it definitely was many kids' first introduction to Transformers when it was airing, a lot of what makes a show interesting is dependent on having that larger context. If you want a Transformers show that's specifically aimed at an older audience, then you could check out Transformers Prime. Like Beast Wars, the expense of the show means that it devotes its time to developing a limited cast of characters, and it has some great interpretations of classic guys like Soundwave and Ratchet, while also introducing some now fan favorites like Knockout. 2015's Robots in Disguise and 2018's Cyberverse kind of occupy the same sort of niche of a lighthearted, child-friendly show, but they're different in their perspective. Robots in Disguise tries to push forward, introducing new types of characters and telling stories without Optimus and Megatron, for the most part, while Cyberverse is a tour through the history of the Transformers franchise aimed at a younger audience. If you ever wanted to see a G-rated version of the guy who thinks Megatron is a race traitor, then Cyberverse might be for you. And the latest series, Earthspark, embraces the multi-generational aspect of Transformers and brings the story back to Earth in a meaningful way for the first time in a while. It's still more of a kids show than Prime, as most shows in the future will probably continue to be, but it feels more like it's for families, taking place decades after a Generation 1-ish backstory and including some surprising growth for characters that parents may not have seen since they were kids. If Earthspark does seem a little immature for your tastes, the most recent Transformers animated series aimed primarily at an older audience is the War for Cybertron trilogy on Netflix. I don't know that I would actually recommend it though. It's got a noticeably lower budget than other animated shows, and that mixed with its dark, brooding tone, sometimes odd or inappropriate voice direction, and toy-accurate to a fault character models makes it feel more like an expensive fan film series than an official product. Comics are probably the second most consistently important storytelling medium in the franchise, and there's 4 major eras of comics to consider if you want to start reading them. The first is the original Marvel Comics, which was itself divided into an American series and one from the UK. The US stories were generally thought of as the main stories, with the UK books reprinting the American stuff and filling in the margins with tales about characters that weren't featured elsewhere. However, over time, the UK stories started to develop lore and characters that became more prominent than their American counterparts and even longer lasting than the cartoon. For example, in the show, the Transformers originated as products created by the alien Quintessons, who then rebelled against their masters and drove them off Cybertron. In the US comics, Transformers evolved naturally on their planet and just happened to be made of metal rather than meat. But in the United Kingdom's comics, Transformers were the creation of Primus, the god of light, an interdimensional being who took refuge in an asteroid after being trapped in the physical realm and grew to become the planet Cybertron. This Primus backstory eventually became the de facto standard origin for the Transformers over the years, though some stories adhered to it more than others. If you want to read the Marvel Transformers comics, I think the UK version is the way to go. Most of the US stories are already in there, and the UK book's author Simon Furman eventually took over the American comic anyway, bringing a lot of his lore to US readers. The second era of comics comes from Dreamwave Productions. While initially pretty well received as Transformers for adults when their books began in 2002, legal issues and internal turmoil eventually overshadowed their actual published material, and the company declared bankruptcy in 2005, leaving many of their stories unfinished and employees unpaid. If you can find any of Dreamwave's stories, it might be worth checking out The War Within, written by the G1 Comics author Simon Furman and illustrated by prolific Transformers artist and designer Don Figueroa. War Within was a miniseries that was the first serious stab at depicting the early days of the war on Cybertron and imagining what many iconic characters might have been like before they came to Earth. After Dreamwave's collapse, IDW Publishing picked up the Transformers license and started telling their own stories. And despite publishing quite a few interconnected miniseries and spotlight one-shots between 2005 and 2011, there's really only 2 stories from that era that are really noteworthy today. Written by Eric Holmes and illustrated by Alex Milne and Marcelo Mater, Megatron Origins, as the name implies, tells the story of Megatron's origin. How he rose from a simple miner to become the tyrannical leader of the Decepticons, and why he might not have always been a bad guy. The story was originally going to be published by Dreamwave, so it could make an interesting companion to The War Within, and if you've seen Transformers 1, it could be worthwhile to see the story that set the stage for the version of Megatron seen in the movie. Last Stand of the Wreckers, written by Nick Roche and James Roberts with art by Nick Roche, focuses on the Wreckers, who are sort of the Transformers equivalent of the Expendables or the Suicide Squad, a bunch of B and C-list characters who get called in for tough missions and aren't always expected to make it back alive. And while the miniseries is well regarded by fans, it's well regarded by fans and might not be the best place to jump in for new readers due to the density of unfamiliar characters. Roche and Roberts both came from the UK's Transformers fanfiction community, and that sensibility really comes across in their work, especially in Roberts' ongoing Transformers series, More Than Meets the Eye. More Than Meets the Eye, along with its sister series, John Barber's Robots in Disguise, form the backbone of what's known as Phase 2 of IDW's main continuity, a phase that's largely more beloved than Phase 1. And while jumping right into the middle of things might seem a little daunting, once you're familiar with Transformers, all you really need to know is that the 2 books take place after the end of the war between the Autobots and Decepticons, after they've returned home to Cybertron to rebuild. Like Last Stand, they're probably not the best choice for your first Transformer stories, but they're absolutely worth checking out once you're a little deeper in. More Than Meets the Eye is the more popular of the 2 books, and while Robots in Disguise wasn't necessarily bad, it was seen by Hasbro as the main Transformers comic comic at the time and was saddled with a lot more toy line tie-in baggage. So with less importance and less oversight, More Than Meets the Eye was free to tell whatever stories about a starship full of gay space robots it wanted. Robots in Disguise would also go through a couple of name changes, first being renamed to just Transformers to avoid confusion with the 2015 cartoon, and then being relaunched from issue number 1 as Optimus Prime. More Than Meets the Eye would get its own sequel series, Lost Light, but IDW would eventually just reboot their continuity wholesale in 2019 and drop the Transformers license entirely in 2022. Right now, the Transformers license is held by Skybound Entertainment, and the Transformers comic by Daniel Warren Johnson is already among the most impressive Transformers stories ever told. While it does abandon the post-war premise of IDW in favor of another retread of the Generation 1 story, it does that retread very, very well. The book can be equally brutal and empathetic, with the physical toll of the Robot Forever War really being felt in the comic's pages. It's also incredibly energetic, with an almost frantic art style that's a refreshing change of pace from the clean, mechanical look of Dreamwave and IDW's comics. The series has only been running since the end of 2013, so if you're a new fan looking to read Transformers comics, it's very easy to jump in and catch up quickly. The third, and probably the most successful pillar of Transformers media, is the movies. They're also the messiest. In The Last Knight, Unicron is inside the Earth, but in Rise of the Beasts, he's out in space. Bumblebee supposedly fought in World War II, but he's also just getting to Earth for the first time in the 80s. Why does Cybertron look different? Why do the robots look different? Which one of these guys is Wheeljack? Is Transformers 1 a prequel to any of the live-action movies? So, the first 3 Transformers movies, directed by Michael Bay, form a loose trilogy, with characters, aesthetics, and some narrative elements carrying over from 2007 to 2011. After a brief hiatus, the movie started up again in 2014 with Age of Extinction, a film that still took place in the same world and bore the same scars, but traded in most of the characters. Instead of Sam Witwicky, we have Cage Yeager. Instead of Ironhide, we have Hound. Optimus and Bumblebee are really the only characters to persist across all 5 films, depending on how you count Galvatron. Age of Extinction's follow-up, The Last Knight, ended on a cliffhanger that is yet to be resolved and probably never will be. And that's partially the franchise's own doing. After Age of Extinction, Paramount set up a writer's room to try and brainstorm ideas for new Transformers films. A couple of those ideas were used as the basis for The Last Knight, while 2 prequel ideas, one about Bumblebee and the other an animated film set entirely on Cybertron, began developing on the back burner. Travis Knight's Bumblebee, which came out a year after The Last Knight, was initially supposed to be fully folded into the Michael Bay continuity, but as the film developed under its own creative leadership, the needs of its story superseded the need to connect to someone else's. Particularly noteworthy was the very late inclusion of a prologue sequence set on Cybertron, with the robots and their world redesigned to more closely resemble their Generation 1 counterparts. The sequence was done so late in the game that ILM didn't even have a chance to do a thorough quality control pass on some of the assets, so the Decepticon Shockwave mistakenly sports Autobot symbols on his arms. This detail was even included on the Character Studio Series toy, leading to the bafflement of many people who aren't up to date on their knowledge of behind-the-scenes trivia about movies from half a decade prior. But despite, and some fans would believe because of those last-minute changes, Bumblebee was critically well received. And with Michael Bay stepping away from the franchise for the second time, it seemed like a good idea to just let that end of the timeline rest. So the next Transformers movie, Rise of the Beast, was a sequel to Bumblebee and set in the 1990s. And the director of this movie, Stephen Caple Jr., made his movie in a way that served the needs of his story as well. Caple even had discussions with Michael Bay about the franchise's continuity, where it became clear that it was not really a concern, creatively speaking. And as for Transformers 1, which spent even longer in development than Bumblebee, it's clearly doing its own thing in its own universe with no real connections to the live-action portion of the franchise. At this point, it's really just best to treat the movies like the original run of James Bond films. Theoretically, Sean Connery and Pierce Brosnan are supposed to be the same guy, but there's no way to construct a 40-year timeline that makes any sense at all, so it's best to just take each film on its own. If it references one of the other movies, great, but that's not really what the series is about. When people ask this question, they're usually talking about the games published by Activision in the 2010s. War for Cybertron, Fall of Cybertron, Devastation, and a few movie tie-in games. And with the studio series making new figures of characters from some of those games, there's a renewed interest in playing them. But can you? Not really. Activision lost the Transformers license in 2017, so their Transformers games were delisted from digital storefronts on consoles and PC. But if you can find a physical copy somewhere, then you can still play the single-player campaign, and fans have created their own servers for multiplayer matches. There have been some rumblings and rumors about a potential re-release of the games now that Activision is owned by Microsoft, but at least for right now, there's no official way to play those older Transformers games unless you happen to actually unearth a disc somewhere. There is also, allegedly, a new Transformers video game in development called Transformers Reactivate. After years of rumors, the game was officially revealed with a teaser trailer in late 2022 and then got some tie-in toys in 2023, but that's it. The latest official communication from the developers was in December 2023 when they promised exciting reveals and epic developments in 2024, which have yet to materialize. This might seem like a weird question, but I've actually seen it asked quite a bit. There's so much Transformer stuff out there that it can be hard to figure out how to actually get a hold of what you're looking for. The simple answer is the store. But which stores? Is there a difference between physical and online? Why do some stores seem to have different figures than others? And those questions are kind of tangled up with each other, which can make things simple, but also more confusing. To break it down, there are 5 major places to go to get Transformers: Walmart, Target, Amazon, Fan Channel, and Hasbro Pulse. The reason I'm breaking it down this way is because of exclusives. Toy companies and retailers need to have a good working relationship with one another, and that means that some of the big retailers will get certain toys that nobody else does as an incentive to shop there. Walmart, Target, and Amazon are the big ones, and every year they'll get an assortment of exclusive figures called capsules, usually with a certain theme. The 4th place to get mainline and exclusive figures is a group of stores collectively referred to as Fan Channel. These are toys that exist outside the huge retail chains and cater more directly to an audience of nerds with disposable income. Fan Channel outlets can range from brick-and-mortar stores like GameStop to online-only retailers like Big Bad Toy Store and even smaller independent stores like Canada's Ages 3 and Up. These are the stores that will also have more obscure Transformer stuff, like Japanese masterpiece figures or third-party collectibles. The 5th place to get Transformer stuff is directly from Hasbro themselves, through their Hasbro Pulse store. In addition to mainline figures, Pulse will also sometimes have its own exclusives or shared exclusives with some of the other retailers. The trade-off is that there may not be as much to go around. Hasbro still needs to maintain a good relationship with retailers, so seems to carry less stock than those stores as a show of good faith that they're not trying to cut them out of the equation. Hasbro Pulse is also the home of semi-annual HasLab crowdfunding campaigns, which focus on generation-style figures that are targeted more directly at collectors with niche interests than deep pockets. And while this seems like a lot to keep track of, 40 years of Transformers means that there's 40 years of Transformers fans as well. Sites like TFW 2005 or Cybertron.ca have sightings forums with regional threads where other members of the community will post when they see new stuff on the shelves, and there may be a local Transformers Facebook group you can join as well, where people not only post sightings but also sell or trade parts of their collections with other fans. And then there's eBay. Most of the stuff you're going to see available in stores usually is going to have been released within the last year or so. So if you want to find older toys from your childhood or someone else's childhood, eBay is a pretty common place to look. And if you're going to eBay, there's a couple of places you should stop along the way. Action Figure 411 is a great resource that tracks the prices of toys over time, so you can get an idea of what a fair price for a particular item on the secondary market is. The site does have some gaps though. It's great for older Generation 1 stuff, masterpiece figures, and modern generations, but it doesn't really cover anything from the 90s or the 2000s. A more complete index can be found at transformerland.com, which has kind of the opposite problem. While it has a ton of information about vintage toys and sells many of them directly, its historical pricing information is only taking into account its own sales. So it takes a while to generate information for newer toys, and it may not reflect what's happening more widely with figure prices elsewhere. Transformerland also has a very useful identification feature if you happen to dig an old toy or accessory out of a childhood toy box and want to know who it is or where it's from. Google Lens can also be very helpful for identifying mysterious old toys. The third resource I'd recommend checking out is the TF Wiki. It's got up-to-date lists of current and past toy lines, and rather than just being a price guide, it'll also tell you about the toys and the characters, often including any production defects or alternate versions to be aware of. It's such a useful resource that recently Hasbro actually based the deco of a new toy on a picture from the wiki that had incorrectly applied stickers. However, The TF Wiki, while comprehensive and useful for someone who wants to learn more about Transformers, can be misleading. Not on purpose, but there's a lot of information presented in its pages, and because the wiki has to remain fairly neutral, everything is treated as if it has the same importance. And because it's easier to read a wiki page than try and find episodes of decades-old cartoons or translate Japan-exclusive manga, it's hard to tell what pieces of information actually matter. For example, I've seen people claim that the version of Cyclonus from Transformers Animated is one of the more interesting characters in the show. And if you go to his wiki page, yeah, he's a mysterious warrior who just appeared one day, powered by a dark god, and seems to be from an apocalyptic future that he's trying to ensure comes to pass. But the thing is, that's not in the show. Cyclonus is in one episode where he makes a brief appearance in an action sequence and doesn't speak. All that information about him is from a reference book called the Allspark Almanac Volume 2, which was published in 2010, a year after Animated went off the air. And it's sources like that, reference books, Facebook Q&A features, and obscure 4-page pack-in manga that the wiki uses for information without providing a lot of context. A single panel from a comic story exclusive to a Collectors Club magazine where a character watches an episode of the Generation 1 cartoon on interdimensional cable gets its own section on Optimus Prime's wiki page, but his iconic death in the 1986 animated movie is crammed in the middle of a bunch of breathless descriptions of every time he appeared in the show, even if it's just noting episodes that he had nothing to do with. There is an upside to this though. With the wiki giving the illusion of prominence to so many characters, that sometimes has the effect of actually getting those characters onto Hasbro's radar. When the latest HasLab project, Omega Prime, was revealed, fans and Hasbro designers were enthusiastic about the possibility of the campaign's Optimus figure getting a separate release redecoed as a character called Yellow Splendid Convoy, who you've probably never heard of. In 2003, Walmart's wholesale retail subsidiary Sam's Club carried an exclusive yellow redeco of a Supreme-class Optimus Prime figure from a few years earlier. Walmart itself also got an exclusive yellow Optimus toy the same year, made from a smaller counterpart to the Sam's Club toy. In 2004, that smaller yellow Optimus figure was included as a character in a live comedy script reading at the official Transformers Collectors Convention, where he was voiced by a female convention attendee, though remained a male character. More than a decade later, in 2015, the official Collectors Club's Facebook Q&A page, Ask Vector Prime, retconned this version of Optimus to actually be female. Then in 2020, the Generation Selects manga series, which was exclusive to Takara Tomi's online store, would briefly feature a female character based on the toy, whose name the TF Wiki translated as Yellow Splendid Convoy. So, thanks to the wiki and the lack of other faction-leading female characters, Yellow Splendid Convoy became a cult favorite character despite barely even existing, and who might even get a new figure at some point, or at least be turned into a more fleshed out character somewhere down the line. Once you start getting into Transformers, you're probably going to notice that there are a lot of options out there beyond just what Hasbro and Takara Tomy are offering. That stuff, the main stuff, is what the fan community calls first-party product. The next level down is for stuff that's not made by Hasbro or Takara, but is still officially licensed. Stuff like YOLO Park model kits, Super 7 reaction figures, all the way up to the Robosen transforming robots are all usually referred to as second-party stuff. That's not really what the term second party usually refers to. Beast Wars figures would probably technically have been second party because they're made by a subsidiary within the first party, in this case Kenner for Hasbro, but the term second party is used by fans to refer to these licensees thanks to the prevalence of the next term. Third party, the Transformers version of third party, is where we start to get into the illegal shit. With the rise of the internet and online commerce, the late 2000s started to see an increase in the visibility of fans making their own Transformers products. At first, it was just add-on kits. In 2008, a group called Fans Project made an upgrade kit for the previous year's Classics Ultra Magnus toy to give him his iconic power armor, since the original figure was just a white Optimus Prime redeco. To get around copyright laws, they called it City Commander and didn't put any Autobot symbols on it, so as a standalone product, it was just a bunch of pieces of plastic that happened to be compatible with an official Transformers toy. A couple of years later, figures like Warbot Defender, also from Fans Project, began to become more common. This toy was a completely standalone figure designed to resemble the character Springer, whose triple changing feature hadn't yet been updated in the modern toy line at the time, so fans decided to do it themselves. Like the City Commander, this toy didn't share a name or have any logos that would put them in legal trouble, and the figure's resemblance to the original toy or animation model of the real Springer was distant enough that it was more an homage than a ripoff. But that plausible deniability wouldn't last forever. In 2014, another group called Fans Toys made a figure called Quakewave, which was designed to act as a masterpiece-styled shockwave before the eventual official version. Unlike Warbot Defender, this thing looked exactly like Shockwave, and it was only the name and lack of Decepticon symbols that provided any evidence that it wasn't. The only saving grace could be that Hasbro may not own the rights to the character's design. Unlike characters based on Takara toys like Optimus and Megatron, Shockwave was licensed from a Korean toy company called Intex that themselves had licensed the figure from a Japanese company, Toyco. And over the decades, the mold and its license continued to trade hands until the modern day, where it's unknown who actually owns it. So as long as they don't call him Shockwave and don't put a Decepticon badge on him, they can kinda get away with it. Other figures are more of a question mark. The success of Quakewave prompted third-party groups to be even bolder in their character selection, and nowadays there's toys like Magic Square's Light of Peace that are so accurate they're being used as drawing reference by official Transformers comic artists. So, how is this allowed to happen? Some of it might have to do with location. A lot of third-party manufacturers are based in China, where copyright laws are more lax and it's easier to just file the serial numbers off of a character. Some of it might have to do with scale. The production runs of third-party figures are so much smaller than Hasbro Stuff that they might not really be seen as competition. The only notable instance of Hasbro actually going after a third-party Transformers manufacturer was during the HasLab Unicron campaign, which was crowdfunding an enormously expensive Unicron toy that only required 8,000 backers to be put into production, whereas most mass retail Transformers toys are manufactured in closer to 6-digit quantities. The third theory about third-party companies is that Hasbro uses them for free research and development. It takes about 18 months to fully develop a Transformers toy, and Thrilling 30 Springer hit shelves only a couple of years after Warbot Defender, so Defender's success may have shown there was a desire for the character, and Hasbro could also study the toy itself to see what worked and what didn't from an engineering and design standpoint. But legal stuff aside, are third-party figures worth buying? Well, it depends. Third-party groups are themselves fans, so definitely have a passion for Transformers and a desire to make the best figures they can, but they're also very small organizations, which means their figures often have smaller production runs, are more expensive, and aren't made to the same sorts of safety standards as mass-market retail toys. So a third-party figure can be incredibly intricate, accurate, and posable in ways that a toy made on a corporate budget that has to be playable for 8-year-olds can't be, but you might end up paying hundreds of dollars for something that will break if you don't transform it properly. But if that happens, maybe you can find a knockoff. Fourth-party toys, or knockoffs, are the most unofficial of the unofficial toys. These can range from things like oily dollar store toys that only exist to be destroyed, to high-quality reproductions of official figures that take them an extra step beyond what Hasbro's budget and regulations will allow. Sometimes there's even mid-budget knockoffs of third-party figures that end up getting sold at brick-and-mortar retailers. Because fourth-party figures tend to be more direct translations of existing toys than third-party stuff, they're cheaper to make and cheaper to sell, sometimes even less expensive than the figure they're based on. But they also have the same quality caveats as the third-party stuff. Since they're made by smaller operations, they may be using cheaper materials, have less stringent QC, and sometimes feel like they just kind of appear out of thin air. But third and fourth party figures aren't garage kits being made by a few people with 3D printers. These are being manufactured in factories by labor that we don't really know anything about. Hasbro is certainly no stranger to criticism of their manufacturing conditions, but these tiny companies making illegal toys have even less oversight with even smaller profit margins and more reason to cut corners. And I think if I'm gonna make a way too long video about how to be an adult who buys toys made in mysterious overseas factories, it's worth mentioning the conditions that enable a hobby like this. When you buy a mass-produced toy or collectible, you are benefiting from someone's exploitation. When you click a link to order something from Amazon with same-day delivery, you are benefiting from someone's exploitation. And when you go to work to earn enough money to click the link on Amazon to buy the mass-produced toy, someone's benefiting from your exploitation. And, you know, collecting things like Transformers are a reprieve from that, a nice nostalgic break from the stresses of adult life, and a return to a time when you were a kid and you didn't have to think about all the horrifying nuts and bolts that make modern life possible. When you're a kid, sometimes toys just do magically appear one morning, and how they got there doesn't matter. And a kid who doesn't get a particular toy for Christmas might not consciously understand what that says about the household financial situation or how it relates to living in a trailer park the following summer. And then 30 years later, maybe they just get real weird with it, start conflating toy robots with financial stability, and then they make a really long video to try and make it seem like it's just a normal hobby and other people should do it too so we can all be normal together. I think I gotta go think about some shit. Thanks for watching. Okay, where was I? So this video was a look at the first 40 years of Transformers, but that 40th year has already come and gone. And in just the time that it's taken to put this thing together, we've actually learned quite a bit about what the start of the next 40 years might look like. In the toy aisle, the Generations line is going to continue largely as it has been. The next phase, Age of the Primes, has been officially unveiled, and it's going to be exploring ancient Cybertronian lore with the original 13 Primes from the Aligned mythology. The Studio series is likely going to be wrapping up its roster of characters from the 1986 movie in time for the 40th anniversary in 2026, and to replace them, Hasbro's designers have expressed an interest in using the Studio series to explore shows like Animated and Prime, whose more genericized figures in Legacy didn't quite do justice to those shows' aesthetics. We may also see some more figures from Transformers 1. Although it had a truncated toy line during the film's theatrical release, possibly owing to the movie's smaller marketing budget, there is a precedent for a movie to see a surge of new figures a few years after it comes out. I've mentioned before that it takes about 18 months for a Transformers figure to be made, and that also means that these toys are planned quite far in advance as well. As an example, the Bumblebee movie's initial figure lineup was based on the movie's concept art rather than its final assets, and that late-stage Cybertron sequence couldn't be represented at all. But a few years after the movie had been released, we got figures of those characters because there had been enough time for Hasbro to see the demand and implement them in the toy line. So even though Transformers 1 is quite beloved by those who have seen it, new toys for those characters could still be a couple of years away. Aside from character selection, both Generations lines are starting to reinvent their approaches to how the toys are actually sold. Rather than a quarterly 4-wave structure, the Generations line is moving to 3 waves per year, supposedly to more closely align with when big retailers like Walmart do their annual refreshes. This does mean that there will be less figures per year, and Hasbro said that to do this, they're going to be eliminating repacks of older toys that people may have missed, but this also gives people more time to actually find the toys that are out there, provided they actually get distributed correctly. Some of the size classes are also undergoing some change. 2025's Titan figure, Star Optimus Prime, is seeing a price reduction from $200 down to $150 due to its smaller size. This could mean that future Titans vary in price from one year to the next, allowing for more unconventional character choices, but it could also mean that the $200 figures haven't been selling as well, and a reduction in price and scope is an attempt to prolong the life of the size class. Commander class figures are also changing. Next year's Studio Series Commander slot is being filled by a 2-pack of Constructicons to ensure that Studio Series 86 Devastator can be completed within about 6 months, rather than the 2 years it took to release his live-action counterpart. But unlike the Titans, the Commander price isn't changing, though this still opens the door for more variety in what the size class is offering. Maybe in the future we can see a new version of Generation 2 Dreadwing and Smokescreen using Leader and Deluxe sized figures. Maybe an update of Beast Wars Magnaboss made from 3 Deluxe Maximals, or animated Safeguard with 2 Voyager-sized jets. Or maybe there will be some new characters that people fall in love with. The Skybound comics haven't introduced any prominent original characters yet, but moments like Optimus going on the offensive or new interpretations of characters like RC are proving popular enough that we'll probably see them immortalized in plastic eventually. The comic's story will also be changing. Author Daniel Warren Johnson has confirmed he'll be leaving the series after issue 24, which should be published in the fall of 2025. As for televised stories, according to a leaked brand roadmap, the remaining episodes of Earthspark are going to continue being doled out over the next few years, with the new Transformers Cyberworld becoming the new segment aimed at kids, and a planned pre-K show joining it towards the end of the decade, filling the void left by the end of Rescue Bots. On the big screen, a Transformers G.I. Joe crossover movie has been announced, building off a tease at the end of Rise of the Beasts, but aside from the potential casting of Chris Hemsworth, we don't know too much about it. And with Hasbro deciding to stop co-financing movies based on its properties, Paramount would be footing the bill for the film, meaning it could end up with a lower budget or even be cancelled altogether thanks to interest in Transformers movies beginning to wane after nearly 2 decades. And unfortunately, it's unlikely that Transformers 1 will be getting a sequel. Maybe the positive fan reaction will lead to the story being continued on TV or in comics, but its low box office gross likely means that it's not going to be a major continuing story. But that's okay. I've seen some doomsaying about the movie's underperformance, meaning the end of the franchise as a whole, but as we've seen, Transformers is a cyclical brand. It ebbs and flows as new fans come, go, and return. The kids who are growing up with the movie today are going to be the adults who remember it fondly tomorrow. Every new story joins a pantheon of other stories and becomes part of a shared mythology of play. And I don't know for sure what's in store for the next 40 years of Transformers, but I think it's probably safe to say that there will be another 40 years of Transformers. As long as there are still kids playing with toys and adults with the creative spark to make them, well, I mean, AI is probably going to replace all the corporate creative jobs, but as long as there are kids playing with toys, do kids play with toys anymore? Isn't it all like brain rot algorithm videos? I mean, maybe some of those could be about Transformers. So as long as there are kids, though we are kind of destroying ourselves and the planet with stuff like the mass industrialization of shitty plastic toys. Okay, let me try this again. I don't know for sure what's in store for the next 40 years, but I think we might have another 40 years. Good luck.